Chapter 762, Automatic Pathfinding and the Aizen Suppression Team. Aizen Sosuke stood before the tall window, staring into the abyss of night. Despite how far he'd already come, he knew his current power was only the beginning. Looming over him like twin peaks were the omniscient God King and the God of Destruction, Esdiath, monuments to strength he had yet to conquer. Yet in Aizen's mind, their might was but a milestone on his path to absolute supremacy. "Omniscient God King, are you truly unbeatable?" he murmured, voice calm yet resolute. A cold fire lit his eyes, an insatiable hunger for greater power, for evolution beyond any limit. He understood that only by shattering every boundary could he claim true transcendence. At that moment, Esdeath sought out Ethan. Though she wielded unimaginable destruction, she confessed that she'd grown bored. No opponent had ever pushed her to the brink. No battle had ever tested her true limits. She longed for a worthy challenger, a duel fierce enough to rekindle the thrill of combat. Ethan listened quietly, then allowed a small, knowing smile to curl at the corner of his lips. End of chapter excerpt. Ethan could sense exactly what Esdeath needed, so he offered a plan. "Why don't you go into the real world and confront Aizen Sosuke directly?" Esdeath's brow furrowed. "Aizen Sosuke? He's already begun merging with the Hogyoku, and in raw power, he's eclipsed even the god of death." Ethan nodded. "Precisely. Right now, he's in the Hogyoku's awakening phase, but this time, the orb has absorbed an enormous influx of Soul King fragments. He's captured nearly every Fullbringer in the living world, extracted the fragments from them, and fed them to the Hogyoku. The result is a condensed surge of Soul King energy, so intense it might trigger the so-called anniversary form, the Hogyoku's 6th stage as described in the official game." Esdeath studied him. Ethan continued, "Waiting for Aizen and the Hogyoku to fuse on their own will take too long. It'd be far more effective if you provoked him into accelerating the process. He has the potential to reach Hogyoku level Vi, but that doesn't mean he can evolve infinitely. A direct challenge from you could push him past his limits or expose a weakness we can exploit." Esdeath's eyes glinted with interest. "Very well, I'll go find him." The official record states that Hogyoku Fuv represents the final, ultimate fusion of the Hogyoku with Aizen himself, the very limit of his evolutionary potential. Every gruesome clash we witnessed afterward was Aizen incrementally reinforcing his core form with that power. But now, with Hogyoku's potency further magnified, there's every chance Aizen could transcend even that threshold. Esdeath's eyes glittered as Ethan spoke. A warrior to her core, she craved a worthy adversary, and Sosuke Aizen fit the bill precisely. Without a second thought, she accepted Ethan's proposal to hunt him down. There was only one obstacle. She had no idea where Aizen might be hiding. Hueco Mundo followed a fixed geography. Locate it, and you know exactly where to go. The human world, however, was a labyrinth of streets and cities utterly alien to her. Noticing her hesitation, Ethan clicked his fingers. In an instant, Esdeath felt a spark of something awakening in her vision, an innate, automatic pathfinding ability keyed to Aizen's Reiatsu. As news spread that she was about to cross into the real world in pursuit of Aizen, the Arankar and even Kenpachi Zaraki surrounded her, their grips tightening on the Death God's captains' armors and cloaks. They would not let her go so easily. Ethan stood among the few chosen to form the Aizen Crusade team, assembled to safeguard both Soul City and the God World before venturing into the human realm. To prepare them for this mission, the gods opened a special God Gate leading to the real world, and as each member passed through, their bodies were transformed into divine vessels. These divine bodies function like artificial bodies, but on a far superior level. They consolidate all spiritual pressure within a single form, eliminating any stray aura that might disrupt nearby souls. That means no cumbersome seals, like those used by the death gods, are needed, making these new bodies remarkably convenient. To onlookers in the human world, they appear perfectly natural. Esdeath, already fully human, noticed no change. But hardened fighters such as Kenpachi Zaraki and Bailergan felt the power coursing through their veins as soon as their divine bodies activated. In a surprising twist, Bailergan, the Arankar who volunteered for the crusade, stepped forward to join Ethan's squad, while the other Arankars chose to remain behind. And so, with their enhanced forms and loyal allies at their side, Ethan and the rest of the Eisen Crusade team prepared to confront whatever challenges awaited them in the real world. A new challenger emerged in Hueco Mundo, a colossal black hollow whose arrival immediately threatened the fragile balance of power among the Arrancar. It challenged Beilergen for the title of leader, and in their brutal clash, Beilergen was soundly defeated. This black hollow's ability to consume even corrosive energy rivaled, if not surpassed, that of the ancient Ajukas-class hollow Yiji Ba, whose name Ichibe Hyoshibu had long ago wiped from history. Unlike most hollows that evolve into Vasto Lord, Yiji Ba scorned such transformations, insisting that a true hollow must preserve its primal Ajuchas form. As the old saying goes, two tigers cannot share a mountain, and the presence of this primordial hollow inevitably drew Beilergen's attention. Their confrontation raged without any clear victor, forcing both to withdraw and leave the battlefield unresolved. Consider then the magnitude of a hollow capable of holding its own against Beilergen, the being whose very power embodies the decay of age and the certainty of death. Such a creature must not be underestimated. Black Hollow is downright terrifying. No matter how powerful Jijijiba's devouring maw is, it's still just one mouth. Black Hollow, by contrast, can summon countless bite-sized maws no larger than specks of dust, each bristling with massive teeth that swarm over its victims. These tiny mouths merge into a floating smoke-like fog that met Beilergen's decay power head-on and utterly defeated it. Ever since that loss, Beilergen has trained relentlessly to grow stronger, yet he still cannot draw his soul blade. Then there's Kenpachi Zaraki. No one else can match him. His sheer ferocity makes up for any numbers he lacks. The three of them together could sweep the entire Zero Division. Without Ichibe Hyoshobu's intervention, the captains and lieutenants wouldn't even put up a fight. And that's not taking Esdeath into account. On her own, Esdeath surpasses the combined might of the Zero Division. Only a handful of warriors in the entire Shinigami world could challenge her. In raw power, she rivals Captain General Yamamoto himself. Let's go. We've pinpointed Aizen's location. Esdeath's gaze swept the chamber, and in her field of vision, the automatic navigation system projected a bright blue arrow, silently directing her where to step next. Could you please provide the full chapter text you'd like me to revise? Once I have the complete passage, I'll rewrite it into smooth, idiomatic English and rename Luther to Ethan, ensuring he's consistently portrayed as male. Chapter 763. Soul King Power Okiora, no Kiora. Aizen Sosuke, renowned for his calm intellect and formidable strength, paused mid-stride, his brow knitting into a rare frown. An unnameable disquiet settled over him, pricking at his composure. Aizen was no stranger to hidden schemes or sudden dangers, yet this time the warning came unbidden, a whisper of ill omens just beyond his perception. He halted and scanned his surroundings. The feeling was like a thin veil of mist, present, yet impossible to grasp. Was Urahara Kisuke and his masked squad in the human world plotting against him? The thought flickered through Aizen's mind, but he dismissed it almost instantly. Though Urahara was a worthy rival, he lacked the power to threaten Aizen's grand design, especially now that Aizen's own agents occupied key outposts in the human realm. He knew their every move. Aizen inhaled slowly, centering himself. He reviewed the evacuation plan he had meticulously crafted. Every detail from Hueco Mundo to the world of the living had been accounted for. His forces were in place. His strategy was flawless. Yet that inexplicable tug at his senses persisted, as if something or someone lurched on the edge of his awareness. He narrowed his eyes, determined to pierce the fog of his premonition. Whatever stirred this unease was about to reveal itself, and Aizen Sosuke would be ready. Ethan stood alone in the void, every detail of his plan laid out perfectly, yet an unshakable unease pressed against his chest, as though a razor-sharp sword hovered just overhead. He shook his head, trying to force the thought aside. "What is it that I'm missing?" he murmured. As he searched the emptiness for an answer, his gaze suddenly snapped inward. 4 figures had appeared out of nowhere. By his side stood Beilergen and Kenpachi Zaraki. Behind them loomed a massive, unfamiliar black hollow. But most striking of all was the woman at their forefront, Esdeath, the ruthless god of destruction, her expression a blend of defiance and icy detachment. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He prided himself on his acute perception, yet he hadn't sensed a thing. When had they slipped in? How had they crept up on him so completely? The silent approach left him with a rare, gnawing panic. He flexed his senses, scouring the air for their spiritual pressure. Yet the void remained utterly still. No fluctuations, no tremors, nothing. They were standing right in front of him, and yet his usual detection methods registered only emptiness. Artificial bodies, he wondered, disbelief lacing his thoughts. No, that can't be. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to reconcile the undeniable facts before him. When he opened them again, determination flared in his gaze. Whatever cloak they wore to hide their presence, he would expose it, and he would not be taken by surprise a second time. Ethan suspected they might be using something akin to an artificial body to mask their breath and reiatsu. He dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it formed. No artificial construct, however advanced, could fully suppress the fluctuations of spiritual pressure. Whatever method these strangers employed was far more sophisticated and enigmatic. Aizen Sosuke sat upon his throne, brows knitted in concentration. He offered a courteous smile. "Welcome to my world." Esdeath's gaze was icy as she glanced at him. Without another word, she turned to her allies, Bailargan and Kenpachi Zaraki. "Let's begin." Bailargan's face twisted with hatred as he charged forward. "Aizen," he roared, "so you, too, have become a god of destruction." Aizen remained unmoved, calmly seated as if Bailargan's fury were nothing more than a bothersome breeze. With a triumphant grin, Bailargan swung his enormous double-headed axe in a savage arc aimed straight at Aizen's throat. But before the blade could connect, a jet of black lightning streaked between them. With an earth-shaking crash, it struck Bailargan squarely in the chest and sent him flying across the chamber. When the smoke cleared, the newcomer stood revealed, led, Ulquiorra, once Aizen's most faithful Arrancar. Yet as Ethan watched, he realized this Ulquiorra was not the same. There was a newfound intensity in his eyes, a power that felt both familiar and frighteningly new. The bat-like wings behind him split and multiplied into two perfect pairs of black wings. His skin drained of color until it was deathly pale, and the hollow crater in his chest filled with a churning emerald and onyx light. The glow pulsed along his entire form, and the small horns atop his head flared into blazing, flame-shaped extensions of the same green and black energy. "Ulquiorra?" Barigan's voice trembled with disbelief. He'd witnessed Ulquiorra's first resurrection. He'd even seen the evolution into the next form, but nothing had ever looked like this. Barigan's eyes darted away in alarm as Ulquiorra stepped forward, his reiatsu roaring like a hurricane. "If you mean to challenge Lord Aizen," Ulquiorra said, his tone dead calm, "you'll have to come through me." The intensity of that spiritual pressure was staggering. Barigan staggered back, realizing too late that he had gravely underestimated Ulquiorra. This terrifying new form was no accident. It was the culmination of Aizen Sosuke's top-secret experiments, blending hollow and Shinigami physiology to probe the mysterious substance within the Fullbringers. The hollows chosen for the trial were Ulquiorra himself and Yami, and the Shinigami counterparts were Tosen Kaname and Gin Ichimaru. Aizen had never been reckless with such a volatile compound. He had planned to offer the successful test subjects to the Hogyoku once the experiments reached their conclusion. And of all the Arrancar, Ulquiorra alone had unlocked a true second stage of resurrection, his power now eclipsing even his creator's darkest designs. After absorbing the Soul King's fragments, Ethan didn't transform into the Hogyoku Fusion Ulquiorra from the game, but he had still shattered his own limits. His power had advanced so far that it might as well be called the Blade's third stage. Even the bat-like wings he'd once borne had reshaped into gleaming black feathers like a crow's. In every respect, his spiritual body had been reborn. Barigan sneered, folding his arms. "Humph. Ulquiorra, you're more loyal to Aizen than I thought, but loyalty won't save you. I'll prove I'm the strongest." Despite Ulquiorra's current spiritual pressure trailing far behind, Barigan had no doubt of victory. With a cruel grin, he withdrew into his skeletal blade form. "Stay away from Lord Aizen." Ulquiorra didn't flinch, the new power surging through him, and the method he'd discovered to counter Barigan's corrupting energy was more than a match for the traitor's blade. In the next instant, before Barigan could even raise his guard, Ulquiorra's fist struck him square in the chest. The speed was unimaginable. Byrigan staggered, eyes wide in shock, and even Esdeth, watching from the sidelines, felt her pupils contract. She hadn't been able to track Okiora's movement at all. How was this possible? Esdeth's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. This wasn't just a contest of speed. There had to be something more at play. Byrigan, however, simply assumed Okiora's pace had somehow increased. After all, the Arankar was already famed for his blistering swiftness. "Do you truly think you're fast enough to beat me?" Byrigan sneered, contempt dripping from every syllable. With a gesture, he cloaked himself in corrosive decay. Any attack would now have to shatter that noxious barrier first. Okiora didn't flinch. He only regarded his opponent with a cold, unblinking stare. "Are you ready?" Okiora asked once Byrigan's defenses were in place. The Arankar's confidence was absolute, and Byrigan had no idea what fueled it. Chapter 764, Pure Power. "Are you asking me if I'm ready?" Byrigan's voice rang out in the deserted hall, dripping with sarcasm and disdain. His steely gaze locked onto Okiora as though he meant to cut him in two. "No, I should be the one asking you. Are you ready, Okiora?" Okiora, famed among warriors for his unshakable calm and silence, offered no reply. His face remained an inscrutable mask, utterly indifferent to the provocation. "Then don't blink," he said at last, his voice low and certain. "This will be over before you even realize it." A heavy tension settled over the onlookers. Everyone held their breath, as if the very air had stilled. And in the next heartbeat, Okiora moved. He vanished from sight like a wisp of shadow, then reappeared in the blink of an eye, an inky streak of lightning tearing across the hall. His speed was so tremendous that the eye could scarcely follow him. In that fleeting instant, an unseen strike shredded Byrigan's decay-infused aura, gouging a jagged wound through its core. The rent fabric of Byrigan's power quivered, a stark testament to Okiora's lethal precision. Then came the thunderous crack, a shockwave that rattled stones and startled hearts. The entire chamber shook as if struck by a colossal hammer, and every ear rang with the roar of impact. When the echo finally died away, only one truth remained clear. Okiora's pure, unbridled power was beyond rival. Ethan's massive form erupted into motion the instant Okiora's blow landed, sending him soaring like a kite with a snapped string. He carved a wide arc through the air, plowing through crumbling walls and billowing dust until he smashed into the far corner of the chamber. Stone and timber shattered around him in a tragic, thunderous cascade. When the debris settled, Ethan lay motionless amid the wreckage, too stunned to rise. The jeweled crown that had once crowned his brow lay fractured, its precious stones scattered across the floor. A deep fissure ran along his skull, the jagged crack a cruel testament to the force that had struck him. Disbelief and despair churned in his chest. His decay power, the source of his confidence, had been rendered useless in an instant. He could not fathom how Okiora had so effortlessly overcome him. A soft, mocking clap echoed through the ruin, and Ethan turned his head to see Aizen Sosuke emerging from the shadows. Aizen propped his cheek on one hand, his lips curving into an amused smile as he surveyed the fallen warrior. "Ethan," he began, his voice as smooth and cold as ever, "your decay power is indeed formidable, but every ability has its limits. Your gift requires time to take full effect, time you did not have when Okiora struck." He paused, letting the words hang in the stale air. That delay? It was the gap he exploited. Ethan's vision swam as Aizen's words sank in. His prized power, the very thing he had believed made him invincible, had betrayed him in the flash of a heartbeat. And as the mastermind before him stood poised and untroubled, Ethan realized that a far greater challenge awaited, one that would force him to rethink everything he once held true. Even a femtosecond is enough for Okiora now. Aizen Sosuke's voice was calm, brimming with confidence. Facing a speed that almost stops time itself, your famed decay power never even had the chance to take effect, and Okiora shattered your defenses in an instant. This seamless blend of speed and strength is precisely why he triumphed over you. Byrigan's eyes widened as realization washed over him. His once unshakable confidence crumbled. He had expected his decay ability to overwhelm any opponent, but here he was, bested not by raw destructive force but by sheer velocity. Losing to the Black Void's consuming power would have been one thing, To be outpaced by Ulquiorra's speed was unthinkable. "Your power is indeed formidable, Beilergen," Ulquiorra observed, his tone cool and emotionless. There was neither pity nor mockery in his words, only a statement of fact. "But in this world, not Hing is absolutely invincible." He paused, then added with quiet reverence, "Except Lord Aizen." There was no doubt in Ulquiorra's mind that only Aizen Sosuke stood beyond defeat, truly invincible. Despite Ulquiorra's immense speed and strength, they proved negligible before Sosuke Aizen. Aizen smiled and nodded, clearly pleased by Ulquiorra's awestruck expression. "His velocity is such that time itself seems to halt," he said. "In a sense, this is absolute power. Anyone caught in Ulquiorra's wake freezes, as though time has stopped. This is pure, unadulterated strength." A hush fell over the onlookers. None had anticipated Ulquiorra attaining such overwhelming power, or that Aizen could wield it with such ease. What had Aizen done to elevate Ulquiorra to this level? What transformation surpassed even his resurrection? Had Ulquiorra truly transcended the limits of both Arrancar and Hollow? Now fused with a fragment of the Soul King, Ulquiorra's speed was only half the story. His regenerative capabilities soared well beyond those in his second-stage resurrection. Even if his brain or heart were destroyed, they would be instantaneously restored. No vulnerability remained. "Absolute speed?" Esdieth murmured, her eyes widening as she absorbed the revelation. Ethan watched in stunned silence as Ulquiorra moved. Not even she, his most perceptive ally, could follow his every motion. It wasn't just that he was fast. It was as if he'd redefined the very rules of speed. By any conventional measure, Ulquiorra's velocity approached a point where time itself seemed to stall, and the sheer force of his blows would be instantly fatal. After all, even if you could somehow exceed the speed of light, you'd never truly bring time to a halt. In the world of physics, time stopping is purely theoretical. No known object or force can actually freeze time. Yet in literature and anime, this idea serves as a vivid metaphor, a character moving so swiftly that to an observer, they appear almost motionless. If you want to ground the concept in real science, you turn to Einstein's special theory of relativity. As an object accelerates toward light speed, time within that object dilates. It runs more slowly compared to a stationary observer. But crucially, even at the speed of light, time doesn't stop entirely. It merely stretches out. Ulquiorra's speed, then, wasn't literal time suspension. It was an illusion born of velocity so extreme that every fraction of a second felt like an eternity slipping past. And it was precisely that illusion, so complete and so devastating, that made him one of the deadliest opponents Ethan could ever face. To travel so fast that time itself seems to slow to a crawl, you would have to move at a velocity extremely close to the speed of light. But our current understanding of physics tells us that any object with mass can only ever approach light speed. It can never actually reach it. The reason is simple. Accelerating a massive object requires energy, and as its speed edges nearer to that of light, the energy required grows without limit. Since infinite energy is impossible to obtain, no mass-bearing object can attain or surpass the speed of light. In other words, there simply is no finite speed fast enough to almost stop time, because doing so would demand reaching or exceeding light speed, which cannot be done in reality. Chapter 765. Battle. The duel between Ulquiorra and Esdieth was as dramatic and unpredictable as pitting Wonder Woman against the Flash or the Hulk against Quicksilver. Yet here neither warrior could land a decisive blow. Esdieth's relentless assaults cut through the air but failed to touch Ulquiorra's shadow-like form, and his counters bounced harmlessly off her impregnable defenses. Watching from the sidelines, Kenpachi Zaraki's impatience flared. He hefted his Zanpakuto, its blade humming with barely contained energy, and let out a thunderous roar before charging straight at Ulquiorra. "A fascinating move," Aizen Sosuke murmured, his eyes flicking from Kenpachi to the peculiar glow of that soul blade. He could feel no spiritual pressure from its wielder, yet the sword itself thrummed with an otherworldly power. Could it really be a weapon from the divine realm? His question was answered in an instant. Ulquiorra dissolved into the shadows like smoke and reappeared behind Kenpachi, delivering a bone-shattering strike that sent the pirate captain sprawling. There was no hesitation. Ulquiorra pressed his advantage, gathering the dark energies of the Soul King into a single, devastating Sero. The beam crackled with green and black light, as though it hungered to devour everything in its path. With cold precision, Ulquiorra unleashed the blast. The impact obliterated Kenpachi's form and reduced the surrounding ground to jagged craters. Dust and debris rained through the air, and the thunderous echo of the explosion faded into a stunned silence. When the cloud of smoke finally cleared, Kenpachi Zaraki lay motionless amid the ruins, a testament to the overwhelming might of Ulquiorra's power. The battlefield stilled, every warrior, friend and foe alike, holding their breath at the sight of such unyielding force. Boom, boom, boom. The roar of explosions rocked the entire battlefield, sending plumes of dust and gravel skyward. Everyone stared in stunned silence. Kenpachi Zaraki, the indomitable Kenpachi, was laid low by Ulquiorra. No one could have predicted such a decisive turn. Aizen Sosuke lit at the edge of the chaos, a faint knowing smile curling his lips. He had anticipated this outcome. Though he had hoped for a subtler solution, the combined might of Esdeath and her allies simply proved too formidable to thwart quietly. As the dust finally began to settle, 3 more figures stepped into view: Yami Sukehiro, Tosen Kaname, and Gin Ichimaru. All 3 seemed transformed, but it was Yami who commanded every eye. Veins of molten energy, like rivers of hot lava, traced across his skin, and his bulky frame had suddenly contracted to a more compact, almost agile form. The change gave him an utterly terrifying presence. The air around Yami crackled with power. He drew strength from his fury, each pulse of anger heightening his spiritual pressure and stoking the fire within him. When he unleashed an attack, it wasn't just destructive, it was apocalyptic, conjuring visions of hell and purgatory. Any large-scale strike from him left enemies with no quarter, no place to run. On this battlefield, with Ulquiorra's cunning, Esdeath's ruthlessness, and now Yami's unleashed wrath, the tides of war had shifted dramatically. And at the center of it all, Aizen stood back, as composed as ever, already plotting the next move. Ethan's flames were a silent fury. Unlike ordinary fire, they were invisible yet powerful enough to consume anything, even materials that should have been impervious. To Tosen Kaname and Ichimaru Gin, however, nothing appeared different. They'd seen similar phenomena before. Jushiro Ukitake's fusion with the Soul King's hand, the presence of Mimihagi, and even Rangiku Matsumoto's brief hosting of Soul King fragments had left those Shinigami unchanged on the surface. At best, each experienced only a subtle rise in their abilities, and Kaname and Gin were no exception. Aizen Sosuke found this distinction intriguing. The mysterious substance that could dramatically alter hollows and humans seemed to leave Shinigami U untouched. True, Kaname and Gin had both broken through their previous limits of spiritual pressure, but in Aizen's eyes their gains were modest, and he wondered how they would hold up against the Quincy. On the battlefield, Ulquiorra and Esdeath remained stalemated. Each could neither land a decisive blow nor be overwhelmed by the other. Yet Esdeath brimmed with excitement. Facing such a speedster was a novel challenge, and she intended to savor every moment of the duel. Meanwhile, Yami, Tosen, and Gin stood by in support, ready to intervene as the clash between Ulquiorra and Esdeath unfolded. Yami pressed on relentlessly, his blade flashing in the gloom. Meanwhile, Tosen Kaname finally tracked down Kenpachi Zaraki, determined to avenge his earlier defeat. If only he knew how far Zaraki's strength had advanced. Even with hollowization and the power of the Soul King fragments, Tosen would be nothing more than a disposable obstacle to the current Kenpachi, cut down in a single, brutal strike. Across the battlefield, Gin Ichimaru maintained his trademark nonchalance. The sudden arrival of the god of destruction had reignited something in him, the belief that facing and even defeating Sosuke Aizen was no longer impossible. So rather than seek out Esdeath, Gin bided his time, unwilling to gamble his life prematurely. Instead, he sought Bailargan, someone who understood the twisted workings of their enemy. After all, Black Hollow was no pushover, and Bailargan had already been gravely wounded by Ulquiorra's lance of despair. Then the dark, hulking form of Black Hollow turned toward Yami, its grotesque mask leering. "Die!" it snarled. Yami's roar shattered the air like pealing thunder. Rage coalesced into an invisible, colorless blaze that surged forward. Black Hollow felt the heat almost instantly, its putrid flesh sizzling as if seared by some infernal fire. Yet it had no time to recoil before Yami struck again, the forest around them trembling under the force of his onslaught. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he faced the roaring flames with unnerving calm. Slowly he spread his hands open, and from his palms poured countless, dust-sized mouths of pure blackness. They swirled through the air, each tiny maw snapping at the invisible fire, devouring the heat and light and transforming it into raw power for him. Yami staggered in surprise. He had been certain that his wrath-fueled inferno would reduce Ethan to cinders in an instant. He never imagined his adversary's hunger could be so insatiable. Ethan allowed himself a small, almost amused smile. After all, these biting mouths could consume even Beilergen's notorious decaying force, an energy so corrosive that nothing could withstand it, let alone mere anger. As the swarm of black orbs grazed the flames, Yami felt his fury ebbing away. Desperation flickered in his eyes, but he refused to surrender. He fueled his rage, summoning a hotter, wilder blaze in a final bid to break the devouring onslaught. Yet no matter how furious the inferno burned, it never pierced through Ethan's ravenous guardians. Each blaze was swallowed whole, and with every mouthful consumed, Yami's strength waned further. Watching the flames dwindle, Ethan's expression grew steely. He leaned forward and murmured to his ravenous spawn, "Go on, feed." The air around Yami trembled as dozens of jagged, tooth-filled maws, eerily like those in the hungry corridor, erupted from the darkness and lunged at him in a relentless tide. Eisen, however, did not fixate on the mouths themselves, but on their master, the enigmatic black void. Until now, the void's true nature had remained a riddle, but it was becoming brutally clear that he commanded these ravenous apertures with his spiritual pressure. Yami's eyes blazed red. He drew upon his wrath like a furnace, unleashing waves of scorching energy that turned the nearest mouths to ash. But no matter how many he destroyed, fresh maws sprouted in their place, each one born from the black void's still unbroken reserve of power. Worse still, every fragment of Yami's fury that the maw this consumed only strengthened their creator, siphoning off his rage and converting it into more spiritual pressure. As another horde prepared to descend on Yami, teeth snapping in anticipation, Okiura moved with deadly precision. In that instant, he became the shield between Yami and certain destruction. Chapter 766, Mouth of the Abyss. Heishu never saw it coming. One moment he was bracing for Okiura's next strike. The next, he was flying backward, blood trickling down his lip. Okiura moved like lightning, so fast that his form dissolved into afterimages, as if time itself had paused at his feet. No one could track him. No one could block him. Just as Okiura prepared to strike again, a new roar shredded the air. Esdeath's voice cut through the chaos, flash of the god of destruction. With a single tap of her blade, she unleashed a torrent of violent energy, a searing blue beam that lanced skyward. Wherever it passed, the very atmosphere chilled, everything tainted in icy azure. The beam warped space itself, bending light and shadow as though the sun had been swallowed by an endless frost. Shockwaves rippled outward like a merciless hurricane, slicing through the battlefield, tearing at the air with razor-sharp force. The ground shattered beneath the shockwaves, and the horizon trembled. A crushing aura of cold bore down on every warrior caught in its wake, rendering even the bravest speechless. As the ripples spread, reality buckled and rippled once more, and the battlefield gave every sign of collapsing into sheer oblivion, into the mouth of the abyss itself. Okiura's eyes widened as a wave of oppressive energy washed over them. Even before the attack struck, Eisen's expression flickered with tension. He could practically taste the threat of death hanging in the air. The broken jade embedded in his chest, fused to flesh and blood, trembled under the onslaught. A faint glow pulsed beneath the surface, as if the gem itself were bracing for impact. Okiura felt his pupils contract. His own speed was nearly unmatched. Time itself seemed to slow whenever he moved, but this energy was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. In an instant, he realized he could not shield Eisen in time by pure force, and yet he could not stand by and do nothing. Eisen had long been Okiura's lodestar, the embodiment of perfection and power. To protect him, Okiura would willingly sacrifice everything. A surge of fierce loyalty and dread flared in his chest. If Eisen fell here, Okiura's world would unravel, Fully aware that the blow might shatter him, Ulquiorra forced himself to rise. He did not launch blindly into the fray. Instead, he drew in a slow, steady breath and channeled every ounce of his reiatsu into a swirling sigil of green and black light. The air crackled around him as the virtual flash condensed into a gleaming barrier, his final gambit to save Aizen from the impending cataclysm. Ethan unleashed his Thunder Spear, the ultimate technique he'd honed upon surpassing the second stage of Returning Sword. It was the only strike powerful enough to stand against the surging onslaught before him. He braced himself, channeling every ounce of his will into the crackling bolt as it hurtled skyward. The moment the Thunder Spear met the opposing force, an immense surge of void flash and God of Destruction energy, the air itself seemed to tear apart with a rolling boom, boom, boom. Flashes of raw power collided overhead, whipping into a spiraling hurricane that drew down lightning and thunder from the heavens. What had been a clear blue sky blackened in an instant, a colossal, inky curtain of storm clouds blotting out the sun and plunging the entire battlefield into ominous twilight. But the tempest's reign was short-lived. With a blinding flare from the God of Destruction's core, the dark veil shattered. The tornado of unleashed power slammed into the ground, winds roaring as dust and debris shot skyward to merge with the lingering storm. In that cataclysmic moment, earth and battlefield alike seemed swept clean, flattened beneath the relentless force of their clashing energies. Mountains and forests disintegrated into dust under that devastating force. The God of Destruction's true flash had utterly eclipsed Ulquiorra's feigned attack and was barreling straight for Aizen. For a heartbeat, Ulquiorra's eyes flickered with alarm, but he didn't budge. He thrust himself into the god's path, willing to take the full brunt of the blow to shield his master. He knew it might cost him his life, but he would not let Aizen fall. Boom! The world shook under a cataclysmic explosion. In an instant, Ulquiorra's form vanished in a cloud of searing energy. The blast tore him apart, reducing him to a red mist that drifted skyward. Ulquiorra, Aizen Sosuke stared unblinkingly at the smoke and ruin. Guilt tugged at him as he realized how Ulquiorra had sacrificed himself to protect him. He hated being a burden to those who served him so loyally. Esdeath's lips curved into a troubled frown. She had devised this desperate gambit, using a direct assault to exploit Ulquiorra's incredible speed to save Aizen. Yet seeing Ulquiorra struck down so completely filled her with unease. No matter the stakes, she preferred to defeat her opponents fair and square in combat, not watch them shatter like glass under a god's wrath. Ethan couldn't stand by and let Esdeath feel like she'd won. "Ulquiorra!" he cried out when he saw his comrade's mangled form. A blade of agony sliced through his chest, and he refused to accept what had happened. His eyes flared with a feral light, as if he could burn away every ounce of injustice and pain in the world. Ignoring everything around him, even Heiksu's cold, unblinking stare, Ethan unleashed a guttural roar of grief and rage and charged straight at Esdeath, determined to make her pay for her cruelty. But before he could reach her, a dark silhouette flickered into being at his feet. Heikshu stood there, expression utterly indifferent, as though he were watching a helpless insect. "You really do underestimate me," Heikshu mocked, his voice low and gravely, like an echo from a deep cavern. He'd already recovered from the brutal blow that scattered him, as if it had never laid a hand on him at all. Then, almost before Ethan's eyes, Heiksu's form began to ripple and blur, and in the next heartbeat, he vanished entirely. Moments later, a colossal void opened before Ethan, a yawning black maw that seemed born from the very fabric of space. It had no lips or jaws, only infinite darkness and fathomless depth. This was the true power granted by Nakyu, the black hollow Arankar. Unlike those tiny, dust-sized mouths that only nibbled at their prey, this abyssal maw, now fused with his own body, could swallow everything in its path, matter and energy alike. Its edges shimmered and blurred, melting seamlessly into the surrounding void. Ethan froze, stunned by the sheer horror of it. He'd never encountered such overwhelming power. Invisible tendrils of force snaked around him, pinning him in place as if gravity itself had turned against him. Chapter 767. Aizen begins to show his true power. Ethan's fists clenched, his muscles taut as he fought against the invisible force that bound him. No matter how violently he thrashed, it felt like iron shackles tightened around his limbs, holding him immobile. All around him, the power of Heikshu roared, no mere energy, but something almost alive, sensing every scrap of matter and converting it into its own strength. Before him yawned the abyssal gape of the mouth of nothingness, an endless void that devoured everything in its path. Ethan's spiritual pressure, his life force, even the air around him. He could feel his energy draining away, and panic clawed at his heart. Yet, in spite of his despair, he refused to yield. With a final defiant roar, he hurled himself forward, unleashing the last of his power in one desperate strike. But his blow was like a pebble cast into a boundless ocean, swallowed without a ripple. Darkness closed in, and with it went Ethan's final scream. For a moment, his roar echoed through the void, then it, too, was gone, consumed by the mouth of nothingness. After consuming Yami, the void maw slowly sealed itself and vanished. "He was delicious," Heikshu murmured, reappearing in a swirl of shadows. He ran his tongue along his lips, as though savoring the taste of the Arankar he had just devoured. A satisfied smile played at his lips before he turned to survey the rest of the battlefield. Ichimaru Gin stood at Aizen Sosuke's side, eyes narrowed as he watched. Ulquiorra and Yami lay defeated. Only he and Tosen Kaname still clashed with their opponents, and even that seemed unsustainable. "Lord Aizen, this is bad," Gin said, worry creeping into his voice. Aizen inclined his head slightly, his ever-present smile unshaken, but his gaze sharpening to a fine point. "Silver, there's no need to panic," he replied coolly. "We anticipated this outcome. What matters now is that we remain calm and execute our plan." At that moment, a panting messenger from Hueco Mundo burst onto the field. "Kenpachi Zaraki has struck down Tosen Kaname in one blow," he gasped. Tosen's increased power was utterly powerless against him. Aizen's smile deepened, but the gleam in his eyes turned fiercer still. The tide of battle had shifted once more, but he was ready. Even if Kenpachi Zaraki hadn't bothered to play with him, Tosen would already be dead. "Did you actually fail?" Aizen's brow furrowed, a flicker of disappointment in his voice. Jin Ichimaru studied Aizen's face for a moment before asking quietly, "Lord Aizen, should we fall back?" His tone carried an unspoken enticement. Jin knew exactly how to plant the seed of retreat in his lord's mind, hoping to stall any rash escape. Aizen let a faint smile touch his lips, betraying no concern for Jin's caution. Every step of his withdrawal, from the depths of Soul Society through Hueco Mundo, had been meticulously planned to serve one purpose, to unlock the true power of the Bengju and await its awakening. That mysterious gem, said to contain infinite possibilities, had consumed Aizen's ambition. He was convinced that only by mastering Bengyu's strength could he claim his rightful place at the pinnacle of existence. Still, the decision to leave Hueco Mundo and return to their own world had not come lightly. Esdeath and the others had proven far stronger than he'd anticipated, their power pressing on him in ways he'd never before experienced. But Aizen did not flinch. His resolve remained ironclad, for he knew that every sacrifice and every retreat brought him one step closer to seizing the ultimate prize. Ethan stood perfectly still, eyes flicking over the advancing figures of Zaraki Kenpachi and his allies. He'd spent every moment since his betrayal watching for an opening, biding his time until he could seize the advantage. Now that his enemies had him surrounded, there wasn't a trace of fear in his heart, only cold resolve. He knew there was nowhere left to run. The realms of hell, the shattered world, even the Spirit King's palace lay beyond their reach, and even if he and Gin could somehow slip into those forbidden domains, Esdeath and her forces would dog their every step without mercy. "Silver," Ethan said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "We have no path of retreat." Ichimaru Gin, his ever-smiling lieutenant, fell silent for a heartbeat, then inclined his head in understanding. The truth of their situation was as clear to him as it was to Ethan. They would have to stand and fight. "So," Jin said, a faint edge of excitement in his silky tone, "what's our next move?" Ethan's lips curved into a confident smile. He lifted his right hand and gently pressed his palm against the abyssal gem at his chest. As if in response to his touch, the gem shimmered to life, casting a pale, otherworldly light over them both. In that glow, Ethan's calm certainty spoke louder than any words. No matter how tight the noose, he was already planning his counterstrike. Now, it's time for us to reveal our true strength. Aizen's voice cut through the air, calm and confident. Opposite him, Zaraki Kenpachi, a towering, muscle-bound warrior who had never known fear, clutched his sword with iron resolve. Every sinew in his body tensed, and a fierce, almost primal aura pulsed from him as he charged. Unfazed, Aizen watched the assault unfold. In the blink of an eye, he vanished and reappeared directly in Kenpachi's path, as silent and insubstantial as a phantom. Raising a single, effortless hand, he moved with the grace of a master conductor guiding an orchestra, each motion deceptively light yet brimming with impossible power. When their blades met, the collision sounded like a peal of thunder. A shockwave as violent as a volcanic blast rippled outward, warping the very air. Gale-force winds tore across the battlefield, and nearby buildings shuddered before collapsing into heaps of rubble. Dust and debris spiraled skyward, turning the scene into a chaotic storm of destruction. Neither combatant budged. Their locked weapons sparked and hummed, each warrior standing firm as the battlefield trembled around them. Amid the surrounding chaos, Aizen stood unmoved, a rock in a storm. He tilted his head and offered Ethan a faint, confident smile. "Ethan," he called out, his voice cool and measured, "your strength has grown. Tell me, have you now surpassed a god of death's limits?" Ethan only snorted in response, narrowing his eyes. He deliberately restrained himself at first, afraid that an all-out strike might seriously wound his opponent. When he realized Aizen had effortlessly caught his blade, however, a surge of relief and respect washed over him. That single act proved Aizen's power. Drawing a deep breath, Ethan re-anchored his feet and brought his sword down in a ferocious blow. This time he unleashed everything he had, determined to discover Aizen's breaking point. Aizen didn't flinch. He planted his feet and met Ethan's strike head-on, steel clashing against steel with earth-shaking force. Shock waves radiated outward like a world-shattering hurricane, buffeting the ground and threatening to upend everything in their path. Chapter 768, Evolved. A thunderous roar split the air, an explosion so powerful that the earth beneath them fissured and crumbled like fragile ice. Plumes of dust and smoke billowed upward and spread out in great rolling waves, reminiscent of gunpowder clouds on a war-torn battlefield. Jagged fragments of rock and debris whistled through the air like deadly shrapnel, scraping the senses and rattling the soul. At the heart of this cataclysm stood Aizen, momentarily driven back by the force of his own attack. He skidded across the fractured ground for hundreds of meters before finally coming to a halt, his silhouette looming tall and unbowed in the choking haze. He looked every bit the unbreakable pine tree in a furious storm, unyielding, resolute. With deliberate calm, Aizen brushed the dust from his robes, as though straightening his coat after a mere inconvenience. Then he lifted his gaze toward the distant figure of Zaraki Kenpachi. Despite the chaos of the battlefield, Aizen's eyes shone with genuine admiration, and something more, a keen anticipation. Here stood a warrior worthy of his full strength. Here was a rare opponent he had longed to face. Their gazes locked, and for a moment the world seemed to still around them. The ashes settled, the wind stilled. All that remained was the silent acknowledgement between two titans. The battle was far from over, and the true conflict was only just beginning. Ethan stood guard at the chamber's entrance, every nerve on edge as Aizen turned to face him. "Impressive power," Aizen said quietly, his calm voice carrying an undeniable weight. "The evolution of Bengu has begun." At once, his spiritual pressure trembled, rippling through the air like a sudden gale. From the cracked jade at his chest, a pale substance began to seep, stretching into fine filaments that wove themselves around his body. Within moments, the glowing white web covered him completely, forming a sacred-looking cocoon. As the film spread, Aizen's overwhelming aura settled into perfect stillness, as if absorbed by this strange new armor. Only his eyes, bright and unblinking, remained visible, cutting through the luminescent shell. In that silent chamber, Ethan felt the surge of power vanish from the air, not destroyed but tightly sealed within Aizen's mysterious exoskeleton. Whatever transformation was underway, it was far from over, and the real test was only just beginning. At that moment, Aizen looked every bit like a butterfly cocooned in a white chrysalis, poised on the brink of transformation. His expression remained stern, but deep in his eyes there danced a subtle spark of anticipation. "I must thank you," he said softly, voice low and rough, yet strangely magnetic, "for the pressure you've placed on me." His words carried across the deserted battlefield, echoing off shattered walls and giving the silent air a weighty intensity. It is pressure, environmental pressure, the pressure of life itself, that forces evolution. You furnished me with exactly that. Your attacks, your defiance, your rage, they became the very catalysts of my growth. Eisen paused, as though savoring the taste of his revelation, then went on to explain his theory. He believed the power of death was not boundless, but limited by the soul's own strength. Beyond a certain point, he argued, no matter how fervently one sought more power, death's force would plateau. Those, he called them, were the shackles of life, the invisible boundary that even death could not breach. Yet Eisen refused to accept any such limits. He hungered for more, stronger power that would shatter life's restraints altogether. And now, having absorbed every challenge thrown at him, he stood ready for the final metamorphosis. Ethan had been relentlessly seeking any path to push past his limits, desperate for even a sliver of hope to break through. In his research, he uncovered the secret of Bengu, a mysterious wellspring of boundless energy and untapped potential. Bengu could not only evolve and amplify a Shinigami's power, but even shatter the chains of mortality itself. Realizing he had discovered the key to transcendence, Ethan began to channel Bengu's energy, letting it flow into his soul and reshape him from within. Normally, he explained in a calm, even tone, a Shinigami's strength is constrained by the limits of their spirit. Once the soul reaches its peak, growth stalls. That's the seal of life. To go beyond it, a death god must reorganize the very structure of their soul. Zaraki Kenpachi scoffed. He was a warrior through and through, a believer only in the edge of his blade and the might of his own arm. He had no patience for theories of souls and seals. With a roar that shook the air, Kenpachi hefted his massive sword and charged. In a single savage arc, he unleashed a strike so fierce it seemed determined to cleave Ethan in two. Eisen shook his head subtly, as though Kenpachi's furious charge barely registered with him. With a single, effortless horizontal sweep of his Zanpakuto, he sliced through the air as though tearing open a rift in the sky, and neatly deflected Kenpachi's blade. Despite all its raw power, Zaraki Kenpachi's strike failed to graze Eisen's defense. "It's pointless to reason with a wild beast," Eisen observed, his voice soft and tinged with unspoken sorrow rather than anger. He remained utterly composed, his calm undisturbed by Kenpachi's onslaught. He understood. For all the captain's strength and battle hunger, Kenpachi could not grasp his true purpose. Between them lay a chasm as vast as heaven and earth. "By ascending to the throne of the god of destruction," Eisen continued, "I have reforged my soul and attained a power that borders on divinity." He fixed Kenpachi with a steady gaze, every word striking with surgical precision. The captain's faith in nothing but his own might and sword stood in stark contrast to Eisen's pursuit of transcendent power, a gulf neither combat nor conversation could bridge. "Enough talk," Eisen said at last, his voice cool as steel. "We have more important work to complete." With that, he prepared to close the distance once more, his confidence absolute, and Kenpachi found himself for the first time not eager for the clash, but troubled by the calm before it. "Then prove it. Strike me down." Kenpachi Zaraki roared, unleashing the full extent of the techniques he'd honed under Unohana Retsu. His blade moved with unprecedented speed and ferocity, each swing a torrential gale aimed at Eisen. Dang! The clash of steel rang out like thunder. Eisen's body snapped back from the impact, but before he could recover, Kenpachi pressed the attack, chopping at him relentlessly. Eisen barely managed to block each blow, frantically searching for a chance to retaliate. Yet Kenpachi's onslaught showed no sign of slowing. Every strike drove Eisen farther onto the defensive. A flash of disbelief crossed Eisen's eyes. He had been certain Kenpachi was spent, that the captain's reserves were dry. Instead, he faced a power he hadn't expected, a hidden strength now unleashed. Panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. An invisible vice tightened around his heart. Even as a Shinigami augmented by the Hogyoku, Eisen's spiritual pressure, slicing power, speed, defenses, and healing abilities had reached heights few could match. But against Kenpachi's unleashed fury, all those advantages began to feel insufficient. Aizen realized, with a cold shock, that he was no longer in control of this battle, and that realization terrified him. Chapter 769, Rebirth from the Cocoon. Aizen's power had already surpassed the level of any captain, even standing shoulder to shoulder with Captain General Yamamoto, and yet, facing Kenpachi Zaraki, he felt a pressure unlike anything before. Zaraki's eyes blazed with ferocity. He cast aside every reservation and launched himself at Aizen with unrestrained force. He stomped the ground, sending a web of cracks racing outward, then shot forward like an arrow released from a taut bowstring. In an instant, he was before Aizen, his soul blade raised high. With a roar, he drove it down in a vicious slash aimed at Aizen's shoulder. This strike carried the full weight of Kenpachi Zaraki's strength and skill, every ounce of his rage and frustration. He wanted Aizen to experience the raw power of his wrath. Caught off guard, Aizen's eyes widened in genuine panic for the first time. His pupils pinched shut as he recognized the extraordinary danger closing in on him. Zaraki's blade cut through the air, creating a fierce gale that howled toward Aizen. Yet Aizen did not back down. He understood that any attempt to flee now would only plunge him deeper into peril. Ethan gritted his teeth and braced his stance, pressing every ounce of strength into his blade as he met Kenpachi Zaraki's vicious strike. Yet from the instant steel clashed against steel, he knew the task was nearly impossible. Kenpachi's power was simply overwhelming. The collision erupted with a deafening roar. A brutal shockwave, like a landslide swept by a tsunami, surged through Ethan's arm, driving him backward. Pain thundered up his limb, bone and sinew threatening to give way under the onslaught. Boom! The shockwave ripped through the air, tearing at the very ground beneath them. Ethan was thrown off his feet, skidding backward until the earth cracked open beneath him and collapsed into a yawning crater. He fought to stay upright, but his knees sank into the mire, and each breath came ragged with mud and exhaustion. He looked down at his sword-wielding arm, now numb and throbbing, and felt a familiar sting of helplessness tighten in his chest. He had never been so thoroughly outmatched, never felt so inadequate. "This is the first time I've truly craved more power," Ethan muttered, voice low and fierce with longing. At that moment, the gem embedded in Ethan's chest pulsed with a soft, inner light. Under its guidance, his soul began to reform, a mysterious energy coalescing around him as if something had been gestating deep within. With every second, the gem's radiance intensified, and with it, Ethan felt his power swell, as though he had shattered an unseen barrier. But he refused to let his guard down. He knew Kenpachi Zaraki's assault would not stop just because Ethan was regaining strength. He had to be fully restored or risk slipping into an even more dangerous predicament. Steeling himself, Ethan pushed up onto one knee, using the shaft of his Zanpakuto for support. The blade's tremendous weight bore down on his arms, crushed them beneath its white wrapping, which had already begun to crack under the strain. Pain lanced through him, but he would not yield. Instead, the aura radiating from his body surged even higher, as if an unseen force now buoyed him up. Across the battlefield, Kenpachi's grin remained unchanged. His eyes glittered with anticipation, clearly untroubled by Ethan's growing energy. The two stood poised on the brink of their next clash, one determined to press the attack, the other reborn in power and ready to fight back. He could feel it. Aizen was undergoing some kind of transformation, one that would almost certainly make him stronger. But instead of fear, he felt excitement. He was more eager than ever to pit his strength against the traitors. "Come on, show me what you've got. Let me see your true power." Kenpachi Zaraki roared as he hefted his Zanpakuto, eyes ablaze with anticipation. His attack fell like a thunderstorm, fast, fierce, and unrelenting. Then, from the strange jade embedded in Aizen's chest, a blinding flash erupted, as if released from a boundless well of energy. In an instant, a wave of purple-black Reiatsu burst outward, sweeping across the battlefield like a violent gale. The shock shattered the earth beneath them, hurling rock and dust into the air in a chaotic whirlwind. Still, Kenpachi did not falter. With a feral grin, he surged forward, his blade cutting through the oppressive pressure as though it were nothing. Clang! Metal rang sharply as his sword struck the white substance coating Aizen's neck, sparks flying from the force of the blow. The white coating had proven to be a formidable defense, but Kenpachi Zaraki's blade finally shattered it. With a fearsome roar, he drove his sword ever deeper, as if intent on severing Aizen's spine in one stroke. Yet just when the tip of his blade was about to reach its mark, a sudden surge of unseen force erupted from Aizen's core. In an instant, it congealed into an invisible wall of spiritual pressure. That barrier was unbreakable. Kenpachi's sword skidded to a halt against it, unable to penetrate. At the same time, the pressure wave blasted outward, forcing the fierce captain to stagger back under its recoil. Aizen's body trembled from the impact, but he immediately regained his composure. Tilting his head back, he fixed Kenpachi with a self-satisfied smile. "Thank you, Kenpachi Zaraki," he said, voice dripping with smug triumph. "If it weren't for your strength, I would never have advanced so quickly." His tone blended humility with arrogance, and his eyes glinted with pure defiance. As he finished speaking, the spiritual pressure barrier around him congealed into a rock-solid shell, an impenetrable fortress protecting its master. The barrier of spiritual pressure continued to hum with power, its radiance pushing back the howling winds around them. Aizen raised his Zanpakuto, the blade catching the moonlight in a cold, hard gleam. With a single savage stroke, he unleashed a torrent of brilliant sword energy that ripped through the night sky like a jagged lightning bolt, an attack charged with the force to tear the world apart. Kenpachi Zaraki only sneered. Without even drawing his own sword, he lifted a hand and slapped the onrushing energy aside as casually as one might swat away a bothersome fly. The redirected blade pressure curved sharply at a right angle, carving everything in its path to splinters. Aizen's eyes widened. Even after his rebirth from the cocoon and his ascension into the realm of the god of destruction, he had not anticipated this disparity in power. Zaraki's sealed potential, once thought subdued, had clearly grown far stronger than Aizen had predicted. But he only drew in a slow, controlled breath. It didn't matter. Not now. Aizen was confident that he would soon eclipse Kenpachi Zaraki. After all, every soul has its limits. Chapter 770. Ever-Shifting Perspectives. Aizen Sosuke's voice cut through the emptiness of the battlefield like a scythe. Even the god of destruction has his limits, Kenpachi Zaraki, and you are fated to be outmatched by me. Kenpachi said nothing. He simply tightened his grip on his blade, its edge flickering with cold fire. When their gazes locked, an invisible current snapped between them, stirring up dust and gravel in a roaring whirlwind. In that moment, they looked less like two men than like phantoms born of the wind's own wrath. "Enough talk!" Kenpachi's roar shattered the stillness. Without warning, he vanished from sight, reappearing in an instant, a blur of motion slicing through the air as he lunged at Aizen. The speed of his advance left a faint trail shimmering where he had been. Aizen allowed himself a faint, approving smile. He barely moved his feet. Instead, he raised his own blade. A crackling wave of sword energy erupted from its tip, colliding with Kenpachi's onrush in a burst of blinding light and thunderous force. Dust and debris exploded outward as their wills and their blades clashed in a duel that shook the very ground beneath them. Ethan's blade met his opponent's sword in midair with a deafening roar. Each strike unleashed a surge of spirit energy that rippled outward like a shock wave, whipping up dust and gravel into a spiraling vortex. The force of their collisions was so intense that an invisible barrier of spiritual pressure seemed to seal off the battlefield. Spectators at the edge of the clearing could no longer track their lightning-fast movements. All they could do was watch the tremors in the air and listen to the thunderous booms as wind and energy clashed. With every furious impact, afterimages flickered across the sky, weaving a vast, ever-shifting pattern overhead. The shockwaves tore at the world itself. Trees were uprooted or shattered, boulders exploded into fine dust, and nearby wooden structures crumbled to splinters. Fragments of wood and stone whirled through the gale, carried away by the relentless winds born of Ethan and his rival's titanic struggle. The wind howled like a living thing, and forks of lightning danced across the sky, each thunderclap rattling the very air. The once clear blue heavens were swallowed by heavy, leaden clouds, plunging the earth into an uneasy twilight. The ground trembled beneath their feet, as though the world itself might tear apart at any moment. Then, with a sharp, metallic ring, clang, The clash of swords shattered the tumult, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. The sound rippled outward, arresting every gaze on the battlefield. There, standing apart from the fray, were Kenpachi Zaraki and Sosuke Aizen. Both radiated such overwhelming spiritual pressure that it felt poised to consume everything around them. Between the two warriors, a vast surge of energy erupted, sweeping away clouds of dust and debris. In an instant, sunlight broke through the turmoil, the sky cleared, and day returned. In that brilliant glare, the figures of Kenpachi and Aizen stood out in sharp relief, two titans locked in a clash of wills. "It's exhilarating," Aizen admitted, hovering in midair. His eyes sparkled with genuine excitement as he faced Kenpachi. "I haven't experienced such a perfectly matched opponent in ages." Ethan's voice rang out with pure exhilaration. To him, this battle was its own reward. He was on the verge of surpassing Kenpachi Zaraki, his equal until now, and he savored every heartbeat of the contest. Once he pulled ahead, the thrill of evenly matched combat would be gone forever. He knew opportunities like this were rarer than dragon's teeth, and he intended to throw everything he had into the fight, leaving no regrets behind. "Is that so?" Kenpachi's voice rolled across the battlefield like thunder, eyes blazing with contempt. "Then I'll just have to work harder to carve you up myself." Kenpachi believed Ethan's confident words to be nothing but hot air. Yet Ethan refused to back down. He shook his head, pity glimmering faintly in his gaze, and spoke in a steady, unhurried tone. "Kenpachi Zaraki, you've climbed to this height by reinventing yourself as the god of destruction. You have every right to swagger before ordinary foes, but against me, you're on the cusp of obsolescence. Now would be a good time to set aside that arrogance." Without another word, Kenpachi proved Ethan's point. He took a single step forward and vanished. In the blink of an eye, the godlike swordsman evaporated from sight, reminding Ethan that in a battle between true titans, words mattered little compared to the ferocity of action. The next instant, Kenpachi Zaraki appeared at Aizen's side. Without any warning, his blade whistled through the air like a bolt of lightning as he swung at Aizen. The attack came so suddenly that Aizen only managed to twist to the side. Even so, the edge of Kenpachi's sword cut into him, and the force of the blow sent Aizen sprawling to the ground like a cannonball. Kenpachi didn't pause. He launched himself upward, a shooting star streaking through the sky, his long sword held high. Before Aizen could rise, Kenpachi's blade descended in a lethal arc. The two swords met with a deafening clang, an explosion of sound so fierce it felt as if the heavens were cracking open and the earth was splitting beneath them. The shockwave rippled through the air, warping the very space around them. With a final thunderous boom, the swords snapped apart. The impact detonated a circle of deep craters beneath their feet, fissures fanning out like spiderweb cracks across the battlefield. Even a light stroke of their blades was enough to tear up the ground. In that suspended moment, it was clear neither warrior would yield an inch. Ethan touched down lightly, planting both feet on the shattered earth. His face was drawn, nearly ashen, yet his eyes blazed with exhilaration. He drew in a deep breath, centered himself, and braced for whatever furious onslaught lay ahead. He knew this was only the opening salvo. The real battle was about to begin. High above him, Zaraki Kenpachi hurtled down like a meteor. In his hand gleamed the massive blade of his signature technique, mountain collapse, earth-splitting slash. Ethan met the blow head-on, their swords colliding with a thunderous boom that rippled through the ground like tidal waves. Every clash sent out shockwaves of compressed air, each followed by roaring gas explosions that lit the air with jagged forks of lightning. They fought with breathtaking speed and raw power, trading unstoppable blows back and forth between sky and earth. Sparks blossomed in their wake, blinding, beautiful bursts of energy that rained down around them. To any onlooker, it might have seemed a duel of perfect equals. But Ethan felt the truth in his bones. His own evolution was accelerating, growing faster with every passing moment. Just moments ago, his power surge had begun to taper. That hiccup, he realized, had come from the crushing pressure of Kenpachi's assault. Now that pressure was easing, and Ethan's growth was surging ahead once more. He allowed himself the faintest of smiles as he raised his sword again. This was only the beginning, and he was more than ready for whatever came next. But the fragile balance didn't last long. Ethan soon realized he was slipping into a disadvantage. Zaraki Kenpachi's assaults grew more ferocious with each passing moment, and every strike sent shockwaves of power through him, power he could barely muster. Desperate to keep pace, Ethan pushed himself into ever deeper transformations, tapping reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. Yet no matter how far he went, the gap between them only widened. He probed his limits again and again, but every new form felt stifled, as if an invisible wall held him in check. Doubt flickered in his eyes, his breath came in ragged gasps. All around them, the battlefield fell deathly silent, broken only by the cruel whisper of Kenpachi's spirit blade slicing through the air, trailing silver sparks in its wake. Ethan's pupils shrank to pinpricks. Time seemed to slow. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat threatening to rupture his ribs. Panic surged. He felt the world collapsing in on him. He willed himself to move, but his body wouldn't obey. An unseen force bound his limbs. In that frozen instant, Kenpachi's blade descended in a brutal arc straight for Ethan's chest. There was no room to evade, no margin for error. Bracing every ounce of his will, Ethan prepared for the impact, knowing that only one outcome awaited them both. Zaraki Kenpachi's silhouette swelled in Aizen's vision, his sword ablaze like the first light of dawn cutting through midnight shadows. Aizen had only seconds to register the gleaming blade barreling toward him before panic seized his heart. No. This can't be how it ends, he thought desperately. Summoning every scrap of spiritual power, he threw up his defense, only to have it shredded in an instant, as if it were nothing more than tissue paper. Then came the sickening click of steel on bone. Blood exploded from Aizen's throat in a furious arc, drenching his robes crimson. His world tipped and blurred. Sound and motion dissolved into waves of pain. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Ethan, once determined to avenge himself upon this man, felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He had never imagined Aizen could wield such strength. Now, seeing him beheaded by Kenpachi's ferocious strike, an emptiness hollowed out his very core. Is this how Aizen dies? Ethan whispered, voice barely more than a breath. The truth felt impossibly cruel. Yet there it was, unmistakable. Just as he braced himself for the silence of victory, the battlefield shuddered with a new, terrifying energy, an aura that threatened to upend everything they thought they knew. Aizen lifted his severed head, still attached only by flesh and skin, and pressed it back into place. Under Bengyu's magic, bone and sinew wove themselves together in an instant, restoring him as if he'd never been wounded. The onlookers stood frozen, unable to believe that a man who'd just been decapitated could now stand on his feet. Calmly, Aizen brushed the last traces of blood from his neck, as though awakening from a vague nightmare. He cast a contemptuous glance at Wielding and allowed a cool, confident smile to cross his face. Bengyu's power guarantees my immortality, he said. Whenever I reach my limit or face death itself, it will drive me to evolve into the next dimension. Zaraki Kenpachi, no matter how many times you strike me, each blow only becomes fuel for my evolution. Isn't that utterly hopeless? Wielding staggered back, speechless with shock. He had never imagined that Aizen possessed an ability so potent that not even death could halt his ascent. However, Zaraki Kenpachi's reaction couldn't have been more different. He felt no despair or fear at Aizen's immortality. Instead, a fierce exhilaration surged through him. An immortal body that keeps evolving? Perfect. Just the kind of opponent I've been waiting for. His voice boomed across the battlefield, charged with anticipation. Kenpachi thrived on facing overwhelming power. It was the only way he knew to test his own limits and grow stronger. Now he burned to see how far he could Oh, with a roar, he hurled himself at Aizen, his blade striking like a thunderbolt. Afraid? Ignorant beasts don't even know the sky's height. Aizen's expression remained icy and detached. He lifted Kyuka almost lazily, confidence and contempt infusing his tone. With a single graceful motion, he deflected Kenpachi's assault. Their swords collided in a deafening crash that shook the earth. The transcendent spiritual pressures of the two warriors collided with a roar, sending a shockwave through the air that twisted the battlefield around them. When combatants of such power face off, ordinary observers can neither track their energy nor intervene, but even from a distance, Those watching felt their hearts grow heavy under the weight of that earth-shattering aura. All they could do was stand frozen, powerless, as Kenpachi Zaraki and Aizen clashed in deadly combat. Clang! The ring of steel on steel echoed across the empty field as their swords met in a blinding flash. The blades split apart and traced graceful arcs through the misty air. In the next instant, Kenpachi moved like a hunting cheetah. With one hand, he snatched Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu, his fingers clamping down on the sword's hilt like iron pliers to keep it from sliding back into Aizen's grasp. In his other hand, Zaraki brandished his own Soul Reaper blade, ready to press his advantage. The blade of Kenpachi Zaraki's soul blade flashed with a chilling light, tracing an unpredictable arc as it struck at Sosuke Aizen from an obscure angle. Laden with raw fury and brutal force, the blow carved a gouge straight through Aizen's chest armor, exposing bone and torn flesh. Even so, Aizen's lips curled into a faint, contemptuous smile, his eyes alight with utter confidence. "It means nothing to me," Aizen said, voice cool as frost. In one fluid motion, he withdrew Kyoka Suigetsu, Mirror Flower, Water Moon, the very blade Kenpachi had pried from his hand. With the back of the sword's hilt, Aizen delivered a glancing blow to Kenpachi's shoulder, driving the edge an inch deep. Kenpachi barely registered the wound. He didn't even flinch. With a roar that shook the air, he swung his soul blade again, unleashing a ferocious counterattack against the immovable Aizen. "You're wasting your strength," Aizen taunted. "No matter how many times you strike, you will never kill me." Kenpachi's grin only widened, eyes blazing with fervor. He loomed over Aizen, voice dripping with fanatic excitement. "I know," he replied. "I'm not here to end you. I'm here to push you, to force you to evolve, so I can one day face an even stronger you." Chapter 7-2. This is impossible. Zaraki Kenpachi's calm declaration drew a sharp frown across Aizen's face. A howling gale whipped at the ragged edges of Zaraki's coat, transforming what Zaraki called mercy into a serrated blade slicing through Aizen's pride. For years, Aizen had been the one orchestrating schemes, his brilliance and power haunting the nightmares of countless foes. Yet here he was, outmaneuvered and outplayed by this feral warrior. The sting of humiliation drove Aizen's Reiatsu to surge like a volcano on the brink of eruption. In his hand, Kyoka Suigetsu began to glow with intolerable brilliance. Silhouetted against the roaring wind, the Zanpakuto traced a perfect arc through the air, shredding the silence as it slashed toward Zaraki. But Zaraki Kenpachi didn't even tighten his grip. He lowered his stance, abandoned all defense, and simply met Aizen's blade head-on. Their clash rang out like colliding meteors, an ear-splitting roar that sent dust and debris spiraling in every direction. The very space around them quaked and tore under the raw force of their collision. Their powers collided in a cataclysmic explosion, each strike echoing like mountains collapsing. Yet in the heart of their fierce duel, Zaraki Kenpachi began to show weakness. His arm quivered ever so slightly as he resisted a devastating slash from Kyoka Suigetsu, just enough a falter to invite disaster. Aizen's eyes gleamed with triumph. Seizing the moment, he whirled Kyoka Suigetsu into 1,000 afterimages, each blade shimmering in the air as it lunged at lightning speed. With a thunderous crash, Kenpachi was torn off his feet. He arced helplessly through the air before slamming into the ground, a great plume of dust rising around him. When it settled, he lay sprawled and broken, his fierce silhouette humbled in the haze. Aizen stepped forward, satisfaction warming his chest. At last, he had broken through Kenpachi's relentless onslaught and claimed the upper hand. "Zaraki Kenpachi," Aizen said, his voice cold as ice, "you are my defeated foe." Aizen's voice rang out with equal parts arrogance and disdain, as though he were dismissing Zaraki Kenpachi as nothing more than an outmoded curiosity. "I'm finished with you," he declared coldly. "As I said, you belong to the past." Kenpachi lay on the ground, his clothes torn, his flesh slashed and bruised, dust clinging to every wound. He pushed himself up on one elbow, meeting Aizen's gaze without so much as a tremor in his stare. A sly grin spread across his battered face. "Is that so?" he rasped. "Then let's see how finished I really am." Aizen's confident smirk faltered for the briefest instant. A shiver of unease ran through him, as though something dormant within Kenpachi had just stirred to life. In response, Aizen tightened his grip on his Zanpakuto, Jinghua Suiyue, its blade beginning to shimmer with dark energy as he prepared to unleash a more devastating blow. Before he could strike, Kenpachi surged to his feet and drew his sword in one fluid motion. A blinding shaft of light tore through the dim battlefield, casting long shadows and illuminating Kenpachi's towering figure like a mountain at dawn. Under that pure radiance, his blade no longer resembled a simple sword. It had transformed into a colossal apparition, the Protagonist ghost, its spectral form bristling with savage power. Silence fell for the barest heartbeat, broken only by the hum of unleashed Reiatsu. Then, as the two warriors charged, the world itself seemed to brace for the clash of titans. The mirror flower water moon formation solidified before him like an unbreakable fortress, holding Lanlan's advance at bay. Rand's furious strike was swallowed whole. Ding! A crisp ring rang out, the clash of steel meeting sorcery. The Protagonist ghost blade slammed against the formation's shimmering barrier, sending a spray of dazzling sparks into the air. Rand's fierce, lightning-fast assault ground to a sudden halt, as if time itself had frozen. Ethan felt an enormous backlash surge up his word arm, crashing into him like a tidal wave. Pain exploded through his limb, rendering it deadened and heavy. Stars danced before his eyes, but he grit his teeth and planted his feet, refusing to yield even an inch. Still, his stubborn resolve couldn't mask the dark red beads seeping through his gauntlet. Blood dripped down the hilt of his sword, splattering on the ground like scarlet plum blossoms. He stared at his wounded arm, shock and disbelief twisting his features. "This can't be," he muttered, voice low and tense with rage. Ethan stood on the shattered ground, struggling to accept what had just happened. He had already crushed Bengyu and left Zaraki Kenpachi miles behind on the path of evolution, yet he had lost. To someone he had ostensibly outgrown. It was absurd. As a being who transcended every limit, how could he fail now? Still, the undeniable truth lay before him. He glared at Zaraki Kenpachi, confusion and indignation warring on his face. What secret power lay hidden in that massive Prajna demon blade? How, of all beings, could Kenpachi be stronger than him? "I transcend everything," Ethan roared, his voice reverberating across the battlefield. "How can you possibly be stronger than me?" He was cut off before he could utter another word. Kenpachi's grip tightened around the hilt of the soul blade. Its jagged edge pulsed with ominous energy. "I've doubled my strength since our last clash," Kenpachi said quietly, his eyes cold and unyielding. In that moment, Ethan realized the truth. Kenpachi's victory wasn't a fluke, but the result of fully liberating his soul blade's power, and Ethan had underestimated him. He stood there, seething, as the battlefield fell silent in the wake of this revelation. After Kenpachi Zaraki broke free, his Reiatsu, strength, power, and speed all surged to more than double their former levels. Ethan watched in awe and determination. "If he can do it, so can I," he vowed to himself. Aizen steadied his breathing. His pride as someone who'd long ago transcended every limit would not allow him to stand down. He summoned every ounce of Reiatsu and prepared to strike back, only to find Kenpachi already moving. In one fluid motion, Kenpachi swung his Zanpakuto, Prajna Demon. The blade arced through the air like a bolt of lightning, tearing the space around it to shreds and leaving black fissures where reality itself seemed to fracture. Then, with an earth-shattering boom, the blade struck. Aizen was blasted backward in a high, spinning arc. He crashed into the earth dozens of meters away, gouging a canyon-like chasm from soil and rock. Massive slabs of earth shattered, pulverized under the sheer force of the blow, then vanished as if they'd never existed. Both walls of the rift were marked by countless overlapping slashes, each one a testament to Kenpachi's unrivaled ferocity. As dust and debris settled, Ethan steadied himself at Kenpachi's side. He could see Aizen stirring at the bottom of the ravine, wounded, yes, but far from defeated. The true battle was only just beginning. Chapter 773, Transcendence. At the bottom of the ravine, Aizen lay motionless, like a lone leaf battered by a storm. His body trembled violently, each shake a desperate bid to resist the invisible force that pinned him to the earth. A gaping wound marred his chest, blood pouring from it in a relentless crimson tide that seeped into the cracked ground. Despite his grievous injury, his eyes burned with unyielding resolve. He tried to rise, but the unseen weight pressing down on him was like a mountain, immovable and crushing. His limbs quivered, on the verge of giving out. Kenpachi Zaraki permitted no pause in the assault. Grasping the Prajna demon in one hand, he fixed Aizen with a steely glare. With a roar that echoed through the ravine, he swung the sword in a broad, devastating arc. This strike was more savage than any before it. From the blade erupted a blinding ray of light, a catastrophic beam that tore upward through the darkness, splitting the sky as if dawn had broken prematurely. Under its brilliance, night gave way to a harsh, white glare. And then, with the force of a falling star, the blade descended, slamming into the spot where Aizen struggled to stand. The massive explosion rocked the battlefield, rattling the earth beneath me. I watched as Kenpachi Zaraki swung his blade, unleashing a coiled pulse of sword energy that snapped outward in an instant. The sheer force of it tore through rock and air alike, shredding boulders to rubble, ripping the sky itself with thunderous booms. Plumes of smoke and dirt billowed up around us as the storm of energy swept across the ground like a merciless tidal wave. Then, just as abruptly, it was over. In that heartbeat, the surging sword energy collapsed back into nothingness, leaving behind a jagged rift in the darkened clouds. Through the gap, a shaft of brilliant sunlight descended, illuminating the ruined plain and the lingering haze in a surreal, otherworldly glow. Though the entire clash had lasted mere seconds, it felt to everyone watching as if time had stretched into years. When the echoes finally faded, a vast crater gaped at the center of the battlefield, and there, scorched and motionless, lay Aizen, his head lolled back against the shattered earth. Ethan's silhouette looked almost fragile in the moonlight, but in that moment he was like a wounded beast roaring in silence. The wounds carved into him by Kenpachi Zaraki's sword energy were knitting together at an astonishing pace, as if each gash had been granted new life. With every labored breath, the air around him trembled, gusts rising and scattering dust and gravel in all directions. His breathing grew more powerful, his chest heaving violently. A strange, burgeoning force stirred within him, and Ethan was utterly intoxicated by the process of transformation. He could sense every cell in his body dividing, regenerating with reckless abandon, driving his strength to unimaginable heights. Each surge of power brought a rapturous jolt of satisfaction, and with it, a fresh wave of pain that only fed his metamorphosis. Driven by that exquisite agony, Ethan's flesh and bone hardened, reshaping him into something tougher, something far stronger than before. His wounds knit together at an astonishing pace. The gashes that had once been deep enough to expose bone now smoothed over as if they'd never existed. His strength surged back just as quickly, banishing every trace of exhaustion from the brutal clash with Kenpachi Zaraki. Normally, such an onslaught would leave him battered for some time, but the collapsing jade within him had instead accelerated his transformation. Kenpachi watched with fanatic intensity, refusing to interrupt the process. He knew that only by allowing his opponent to attain his ultimate form could he truly measure his own strength. Deep down, he yearned for the real battle, the kind that made his blood race and left him exhilarated. A strange, powerful aura welled up inside Aizen. It grew more terrifying by the second, charging the air around him with majesty and menace until the very atmosphere he felt suffocating. Something terrible and magnificent was awakening within him. "Sorry to have kept you waiting, Kenpachi Zaraki." Aizen's voice cut through the charged silence. He rose smoothly to his feet, his eyes blazing as he fixed his gaze on the captain of the 11th Division. The real fight was about to begin. A thin smile curved Aizen's lips as he squared off once more against Kenpachi Zaraki. The captain's immense spiritual pressure, raw, brutal, unyielding, roared all around them. Yet Aizen felt nothing. In truth, he felt superior. Every fiber of his being pulsed with a new, overwhelming power that he knew exceeded even Kenpachi's. Calmly, coolly, he spoke. "Ready yourself, Kenpachi Zaraki." In his mind, Aizen welcomed the coming clash. The fierce thrill of combat had always driven Kenpachi onward, and now Aizen would grant him the battle he craved. For this, he thought, was truly a gift from the gods. Across the courtyard, Kenpachi stiffened at the change in Aizen's aura. His eyes flared with excitement. Finally, a fight worthy of his strength. "Bring it on, Aizen!" Kenpachi bellowed, hefting his massive sword and dashing forward like a freight train. Aizen's hand moved in a graceful arc, his Zanpakuto, Kyoka Suigetsu, shimmering with reflected illusions of moonlight and blossoms. With effortless precision, he met Kenpachi's strike, the two blades colliding in a thunderous clash. Then, faster than the eye could track, Aizen pivoted and unleashed a single, devastating slash. Kenpachi barely had time to scream before the blade seared across him. The air itself seemed to split in two, and Kenpachi staggered backward, nearly cleaved in half. Blood spattered the ground, and the sheer force of the blow sent him crashing to his knees. Aizen lowered his sword, his smile sharper now. Was that not exhilarating, he murmured, regard cool and dispassionate. He knew Kenpachi would rise again. Indeed, that was when the real contest would begin. And at last, Aizen thought, the true dance of power could unfold. Kenpachi Zaraki's eyes went wide, and he staggered back as if struck. Aizen followed his line of sight and found himself staring at Esdiath. Of everyone present, she alone had ever earned his grudging respect. Even now, after all the power he'd amassed, he still felt the oppressive weight of her spiritual pressure, an unshakable calm through which no strain of energy could be detected. Yet she didn't glance his way at all. Aizen's brow furrowed. He was strong, so strong that his power kept growing with every breath, yet he couldn't even register on Esdath's radar? Before he could sort that out, an earth-shattering surge of Reiatsu burst from behind him. What? He gasped. He whipped around to see Kenpachi Zaraki's spiritual pressure skyrocketing, at least 5 times its previous level, and still climbing. Aizen froze, eyes widening in genuine shock. Chapter 774, losing consciousness but still standing. Zaraki Kenpachi's wounds had already sealed themselves. The terrifying Prajna fierce ghost had sustained his very being, its counterforce manifesting only during battle. Aizen stared in surprise for a split second before realization dawned. This must be the power of Kenpachi's Zanpakuto. Yet even that didn't faze him. Deep within his chest, an ever-ascending force stirred, an authority far beyond any living thing, awakening like a slumbering god. With it came unshakable confidence, as if the entire universe bent to his will. Kenpachi Zaraki, Aizen said, voice cold and calm, you may possess incredible potential, but here, before me, it counts for nothing. He paused, letting the weight of his words fall. Your Reiatsu is mighty, but there remains an impassable chasm between us, the dimensional divide. Spreading his arms, Aizen allowed the fetters of gravity to slip away. His form rose from the ground, hovering serenely in midair. As he ascended, multiple pairs of ethereal wings, shaped like delicate butterflies but composed entirely of spiritual energy, unfurled behind him. They were not real wings, but a vivid expression of his unrivaled Reiatsu, shimmering with otherworldly light. Suspended above the battlefield, Aizen's calm gaze fell upon his opponent. The air around him crackled with power. In that moment, every soul present understood the unspoken truth. Whatever might come next, Aizen had already transcended the confines of life and death, and stood poised to reshape reality itself. A massive, unblinking eye gaped at the world from the center of each wing, its iris aglow with an uncanny light that seemed to see through all things. Then, with a sound like tearing silk, a single black crack split along Aizen's forehead, a jagged line running from hairline to brow. From this rift spilled a murky, midnight radiance, casting an aura of unfathomable dread, as though one stood before the yawning void of eternity. But Aizen showed no fear. On the contrary, a slow, approving smile curved his lips. Zaraki Kenpachi, he said, his tone dripping with disdain, your spiritual pressure is undeniably immense. Yet even if you could magnify it 10 times or 20 times over, you would still fall short. His eyes burned with a strange, cold light, and his voice took on a hollow resonance, as chill and inexorable as wind through a glacier's fissure. That raw power cannot close the gap between us, for I, Aizen Sosuke, have reached an entirely new plane of existence, one that you, Zaraki Kenpachi, and virtually everyone else in this world can never hope to attain. Aizen's words barely left his lips when an immense force burst forth from his body, his unique spiritual pressure, magnified far beyond anything he'd shown before. It was as though a slumbering colossus had finally roused itself, ready to swallow the world whole. That invisible storm radiated across the battlefield, squeezing the air until it felt almost solid. Even Zaraki Kenpachi, renowned for his iron lungs and boundless strength, found himself gasping under its weight, as if a mountain had been pressed against his ribs. But Kenpachi did not yield. With a roar that shook the ground, he bellowed, "Very well. Show me your true strength." His muscles tightened, veins standing out like cords beneath his skin, as he pushed every ounce of his own pressure outward to meet Aizen's. The two surging energies collided in midair, carving visible ripples through the smoky haze. From the center of it all, Aizen watched with a slight, confident smile. Ethan's mirror flared to life in his hand, instantly carving a fan-shaped arc of blade light so fierce it seemed to rend the air itself. Wherever the glowing edge swept, space quivered and tore apart. His swings were so lightning-quick that all observers saw were interlacing streaks of radiance colliding overhead, each clash echoing like thunder. The shrill report of energy slicing the void sent a jolt of awe and primal fear through every soul who heard it. Standing firm before him was Kenpachi Zaraki, battle-mad and undaunted. Yet even Kenpachi had never felt such overwhelming force bearing down. Ethan could practically taste the tension as that surging sword energy threatened to rip him limb from limb. It pressed in on him like an invisible battering ram, its unseen edge sharp enough to shred anything in its path. Still, Zaraki's grin only widened. Clenching his own blade, the Protagonist-fierce ghost, with both hands, he let the wild light in his eyes blaze brighter. He understood there was no retreat. Survival would come only through raw, unleashed power. Protagonist-fierce ghost, grant me 10 times my strength. With a roar that shook the ground, Zaraki's Reiatsu burst outward in a blinding wave, rushing to meet Ethan's next devastating strike. Ethan drove his spiritual pressure beyond every limit, every fiber of his being trembling with the effort. He knew that Prajna, the fierce ghost, could easily overpower even Zaraki Kenpachi 100 times over. Yet channeling so much raw force at once risked destroying the blade itself before he could so much as swing it. The greater his output, the more violent the backlash, from his feet into the earth, from his body into the rushing air. Ho 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 ho! At Ethan's unwavering resolve, Prajna shuddered as though awakening from a deep, furious dream. A low, primal growl rolled up the blade's length, and then an explosive surge of sword energy burst from its tip. That energy coalesced into the form of a colossal dragon, scales of crackling light and rumbling shadow, snaking forward with lethal intent. Opposite them, Aizen's sword flared in response. It too shaped its power into a dragon, sleek, coiled, and gleaming with ruthless precision. The two draconic forces lunged at one another and met with cataclysmic force high above the battlefield. Boom! The roar shattered the air. Rock splintered underfoot, the distant peaks trembled, and rivers quaked in their courses. Blinding arcs of energy rippled outward as the twin dragons of Sword Spirit and Reiatsu clashed, each striving to crush the other in a titanic, thunderous struggle. The very earth seemed to shudder beneath their might, a testament to the unbridled power these two warriors had summoned into being. A titanic clash of energies tore through the air. Each strike sent ripples of power that collided, canceled, and magnified until they coalesced into an unstoppable shockwave. In an instant, it raced outward in every direction, shredding rock into dust and warping everything in its path as if the very world itself were unraveling. Yet at the eye of this maelstrom stood two unyielding figures. On one side loomed Kenpachi Zaraki, his hulking frame bristling with raw ferocity. Though consciousness had slipped from him, his hand remained locked on his colossal blade, instincts alone guiding him toward the next devastating strike. It was as if, even in unconsciousness, he hungered for the kill. Opposite him, Sosuke Aizen watched in serene silence. His expression was calm, unreadable, every feature composed as though he governed the chaos around them. Still, when his gaze drifted to Kenpachi, the faintest flicker of something, intrigue, respect, perhaps the echo of an old rivalry, passed through his eyes. In that suspended moment, amidst swirling destruction, predator and prey, warrior and strategist faced one another, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. The opponent who had once given Ethan such a hard time now sat there, utterly humiliated. But Ethan felt neither pity nor mockery. Instead, a profound sense of gratitude welled up within him. Chapter 75, the final fusion stage. Aizen, have you reached your limit? Aizen murmured into the oppressive quiet. He inhaled slowly, then raised his right hand, fingertips splayed, and fixed his gaze upon the unconscious Zaraki Kenpachi. A faint, almost reverent smile curved his lips. "To thank you for your assistance," he whispered, voice low. Without Kenpachi's unbridled ferocity to test him, he could never have pierced this final veil of power. The clash of their wills, Kenpachi's raw strength against his calculated resolve, had been the crucible that forged Aizen's ultimate form. A surge of gratitude, unfamiliar yet sincere, swelled in his chest. He would grant his former rival a funeral worthy of the legend he embodied. A ceremony not only to honor Kenpachi's passing, but to proclaim the pinnacle of Aizen's own might. A farewell so monumental that it would echo through the annals of history, etching both their names into eternity. With that resolve burning in his eyes, Aizen turned away from the fallen captain and set his gaze on the horizon beyond. His destiny awaited. Dark crest, half seen in shadow, arrogance and defiance converge, paralyze the Iron Princess in her dreams, bind the self-shattering Clay Maiden, merge, rebound, descend and enshroud. Acknowledge your impotence, 90-fold path of ruin, black coffin. As Ethan's voice finished the last phrase, the very air around him quivered and twisted, as though an unseen hand were wringing reality itself. His tone was low, magnetic, each word dripping with arcane power that drew every eye and ear toward him. In the instant the chant ended, a thunderous wave of spiritual energy burst from his core, sweeping across the battlefield like a rampaging tide. Soldiers and sorcerers alike staggered under its force. The ground cracked, and even the horizon seemed to warp. Beneath Ethan's silent command, that raw, violent energy coalesced into a single, living embodiment of destruction. It writhed and pulsed like a wounded beast until, with terrifying precision, it crystallized into a vast obsidian cube hovering just above the scorched earth. The massive black monolith radiated nothing but cold menace, the 90 black coffin of the broken path. Aizen gripped the ebony coffin in his hands, its surface rippling with sinister energy. To any ordinary wielder, it was already a fearsome relic. Once sealed, its victim would be imprisoned within and assailed by thousands of spectral blades. But under Aizen's command, its power had outstripped even its own legend. Now, instead of a mere storm of swords, the coffin's interior churned with a gravity well so intense that it bent the very fabric of space and time. "This," Aizen proclaimed, his voice cold with triumph, "is the black coffin I perfected after surpassing both the god of death and the hollow. It generates a gravity vortex that distorts reality itself and tears my enemies apart from the inside out." He believed this devastating artifact would finally fell an opponent as fearsome as Zaraki Kenpachi. Victory seemed certain, until in an instant the unthinkable occurred. The coffin, just sealed and brimming with cataclysmic force, shuddered as if struck by an unseen hand. Hairline fissures skittered across its black shell, multiplying by the dozens, before the entire vessel exploded outward in a blinding cascade of fragments. Aizen stared in stunned silence as his ultimate weapon shattered before his eyes. Shards exploded outward like dust in a howling gale, swirling into an invisible maelstrom that weighed down on every soul present. Aizen's pupils constricted into twin black whirlpools as he detected a blurred figure moving through the chaos. At some point, she had slipped silently beside the black coffin, radiating raw, irresistible power. That power surged forward like a colossal wave, pulverizing every barrier in its path. It was Esdeath. She descended with unrelenting force. Her spiritual pressure struck like a shockwave, tearing the coffin's ebony shell apart and reducing it to splinters. Zaraki Kenpachi, once imprisoned within, was blasted out like a kite cut from its string, tracing a wild arc through the air before crashing down. It was clear Esdeath had not come to free him. She had come simply because she willed it. The instant she appeared, the temperature seemed to plummet. A bone-chilling wind roared from all directions, and the very air felt oppressively heavy, so heavy that Aizen struggled to draw breath. Fear flared in Ethan's chest like a raging inferno, and he erupted with an angry roar. But against Esdeath's relentless gale, even that roar sounded feeble. No more impactful than a pebble dropped into the ocean, swallowed instantly by the wind. His cry vanished before it could travel more than a few feet. Still, beneath his fear, a fierce excitement pulsed through his veins. The mysterious gem, known only as the Bengu, throbbed with anticipation of its next evolution. Above Ethan's brows, a narrow fissure silently split open, like the yawning mouth of a black abyss, casting a strange inky glow that threatened to blot out all light. The crack widened further, revealing an uncanny radiance, and then, as if summoned from another world, a single vertical eye blinked into view. It was unlike any normal human eye, deep, inscrutable, as if capable of piercing the very core of reality. With each flicker, that eye pulsed with boundless, terrifying power. Under the unblinking gaze of Eisen's newly opened vertical eye, every illusion unraveled. Falsehoods evaporated, and hidden truths lay bare. As the lid of that eye lifted, a tar-like substance oozed from the center of his brows. Ink-black and viscous, it swirled outward, coalescing into a second, nightmarish visage. Skin seemed to peel away from this phantom face, exposing writhing black muscle and tissue beneath. Eisen's breath hitched. Instantly, the air around him nodded and writhed, as though time and space themselves answered his will. A storm of power surged from his form, pushing back the winds with a force that crackled through the atmosphere. His silhouette stretched upward, growing broader, more commanding. Down the center of his torso yawned 3 hollow caverns, as dark and hungry as the abyss, ready to devour life and energy alike. Suspended just above these voids hovered a fractured jade shard, pulsing with an inner luminescence. Then, with deliberate slowness, several pairs of wings unfurled behind him, each one more imposing than the last. A deafening crack split the air as Eisen's enormous wings unfurled. From each shadowed span, grotesque skull-like heads burst forth, their empty maws frozen in a silent scream. A chorus of high-pitched roars rolled across the battlefield, each one an echo of pure, unrestrained horror. In that instant, Eisen ceased to be merely powerful. He became utterly unholy, a living nightmare cloaked in veils of darkness. Esdeath skidded to a halt, her breath steaming in the sudden chill. She had faced many threats, but nothing like this. Narrowing her ice-blue eyes, she called out, "Weren't you supposed to go through the bloody rebirth stage Ethan warned us about?" Her voice was steady, but the edge of uncertainty cut through it. Ethan's research had made it sound like a predictable, if gruesome, transformation. This, however, was something beyond any prophecy or scholar's notes. No answer came. Instead, a single bony skull cracked open at the base of Eisen's wing. From its hollow eye socket, a compact sphere of crackling spiritual energy shot forward like a cannonball. Esdeath tensed, every muscle coiling as she summoned her ice blade. Frost snaked along the length of her sword, ready to shatter that deadly orb before it reached her. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the projectile hurtled nearer, and the true battle between ice and unholy power was about to begin. Chapter 776, A Tiny Pearl Dares to Shine. A chill wind whipped across the battlefield as Sosuke Izome unleashed his terrifying power. From one of the jagged spines on his wings sprouted a macabre skull, its hollow eyes exhaling a cold, oppressive aura. Without warning, the skull's maw snapped open and spat forth a super-dense spiritual pressure bomb, an ominous sphere that sucked in light and air like a miniature black hole, hurtling straight at Esdeath with indiscriminate, world-shattering force. But Esdeath didn't flinch. She craved the head-on clash of raw power. Nothing thrilled her more than meeting an opponent blow for blow, feeling the shockwave of magic collide against magic. Her heart pounded in eager anticipation. "The flash of the god of destruction," she murmured, raising a single finger. In an instant, a bolt of brilliant azure light crackled into being at her fingertip, a perfect fusion of her destructive might and spiritual pressure. It cut through the air like a streak of lightning, streaking toward Izome's malevolent orb. With a thunderous roar, the two forces met in midair, exploding outward in a blinding flash of energy. The very earth beneath their feet trembled as the collision rent the sky in two. At the moment of impact, Ethan unleashed both his ultra-high-density spiritual pressure bomb and the flash of the god of destruction in perfect unison. The two energies collided and detonated like a low-yield nuclear blast, ripping through the battlefield with unimaginable force. The very air seemed to tear apart, spawning savage vortex storms that clawed at the sky. Fragments of stone and debris were hurled upward, only to be obliterated mid-air by the bomb's overwhelming power. A towering column of flame shot straight into the heavens, as if determined to rip the sky itself in two. In an instant, every speck of dust on the field and every distant mountain peak was swept into that boundless whirlpool of energy. The infernal pillar of fire, like a demonic hand rising from hell, threatened to pierce the very fabric of the universe. All around, the ground trembled under a thunderous roar so fierce it seemed to shake the stars themselves. A scorching wave of heat, like a rampaging beast, swept across the battlefield, consuming everything in its path. No one dared draw near. They could only watch helplessly from a safe distance. In one corner, Aizen Sosuke stood frozen, shock and disbelief etched across his face. His carefully gathered energy, so fragile it might have been a soap bubble, had been obliterated in an instant by the god of destruction's devastating flash. His pillar of fire collapsed in the blink of an eye, replaced by a deep blue shockwave that crackled with unbridled power. That shockwave roared forward like an enraged dragon, tearing through rock and splintering trees into powder. Aizen's complexion paled. He had underestimated Esdeath's strength. Her power was so overwhelming it left him momentarily paralyzed with fear. Summoning what courage he had left, he bolted backward, desperate to evade the oncoming wave. But its velocity was beyond anything he could contend with. No sooner had he taken a step than the shockwave crashed over him. Aizen barely registered the moment of impact. A colossal force surged through his body like a catastrophic landslide or a raging tsunami, threatening to tear him apart from the inside out. He fought to steady himself against the brutal onslaught, each breath a victory, as the aftershocks rumbled through his bones and left him trembling on the scorched ground. Ethan struggled to marshal all the energy in his body to resist, but Esdeath's shock wave was overwhelming. He managed to cushion only part of the blast, the rest tore deep, burning scars into his flesh. Blood bloomed across his pale limbs, and pain shot through him, fierce enough to force a gasp from his lips. Still, he dared not falter. This fight was far from over. Standing tall, Esdeath allowed herself a cold smile as she watched Ethan reel from the aftershocks. Though the strike hadn't finished him, it had severely wounded him, and that, to her, was victory. "Come on, Ethan," she taunted, voice as frigid as ice. "Evolve again. If you can't, die right here." Her words held a lethal certainty, but Ethan met them without a flicker of fear. He knew this opponent was formidable, yet he would not back down. His ambitions reached far beyond this frozen battlefield. He sought not just power, but ascension to godhood. To claim the thrones of the omniscient God King and the Spirit Sovereign, he would need to surpass rivals like Esdeath. She was merely the next obstacle on his relentless climb. Clenching his blood-slicked fists, Ethan drew on the last reserves of his strength. The jagged wounds burning across his arms and chest only sharpened his resolve. If evolving meant unleashing an even greater force, one that might consume him as much as it transformed him, so be it. He would embrace that danger. No matter how fierce the storm Esdeath raised, he would not only weather it, but stand triumphant on the other side. "Esdeath, you're nothing but a roadblock in my path." With that roar, Aizen Sosuke's form blurred, his body transforming into a churning vortex of power. Waves of violet energy rippled outward from him, each concentric circle of spiritual pressure warping the very air until they brushed the edges of the sky itself. This was no ordinary aura. It was the raw embodiment of his Ryatsu, so immense it bent reality around him. Behind Aizen, two monstrous wings unfurled like the appendages of some nightmarish demon. At the tip of each wing loomed a grotesque, snarling head, its gaze locked onto Esdeath as though eyeing fresh prey. Those heads quivered in sync with Aizen's thoughts, as if some terrible force brewed within them. Slowly, each maw parted, revealing rows of jagged teeth and a fierce, otherworldly glow. In the space before them, dense clusters of purplish-black energy began to coalesce, high-density spiritual bombs painstakingly forged by Aizen's unparalleled skill. Each orb pulsed with destructive potential, capable of erasing anything it touched. Steadying himself, Aizen fixed Esdeath with an unwavering stare, determined to uncover and shatter every secret she held. Under Aizen's command, ultra-high-density spiritual bombs tore through the sky like meteorites, streaking downward in arcs of violet-black light. For an instant, the entire battlefield gleamed with fireworks' bright trails, but beneath that splendor lay a single, unyielding purpose: to slaughter. The bombs fell in an unrelenting torrent, seeking to bury Esdeath beneath their weight. Yet Esdeath did not falter. She raised an eyebrow as the hail of explosions drew nearer. "You intend to win by sheer numbers?" she said, her voice cool with derision. "As you just reminded Kenpachi Zaraki, there remains the gulf of dimensions between us." Aizen's salvo was only about 1/3 stronger than his previous barrage, insufficient on its own to break her. What he lacked in individual power, he more than made up for with the Hogyoku, granting him boundless spiritual pressure and an endless ammunition supply. It was a daring tactic, but a reckless one. A slow, confident smile curved Esdeath's lips. "Very well," she murmured. In that moment, all at once, she prepared to strike back with her flash of the god of destruction. Ethan lifted his hand, and a deep sapphire glow gathered at his fingertips, coalescing into a brilliant orb of light. The color was so intensely blue it felt as though it could swallow everything in its path. Chapter 7-7, The Form of Miracles, the Essence of Self-Power. Esdeath lifted her hand in a graceful arc, and in an instant a shaft of deep blue light blazed forth, drenching the battlefield in its radiance. It streaked across the sky like a celestial spear, brimming with such raw, inexhaustible power that the very air around it quivered, and even the fabric of space and time seemed to warp under its influence. Before this azure torrent, Aizen Sosuke's ultra-dense spiritual pressure bombs, once his proudest weapons, shrank to insignificance. These bombs had always carried tremendous spiritual force, capable of shattering any defense. Yet when they surged toward Esdeath's beam, they were drawn in like moths to a flame, and the moment they touched that luminous torrent, they dissolved as if they were nothing more than ice in sunlight, vanishing without a trace. Aizen stared in stunned disbelief. He had never imagined that Esdeath's power could reach such heights. Ethan poured every ounce of his power into those ultra-dense spiritual pressure bombs, but not one of them even scratched her defenses. A knot of doubt formed in his chest. Could his strength truly match hers? Still, he refused to yield. Teeth gritted, he reactivated the wing pods and condensed bomb after bomb, sending them streaking toward the deep blue radiance like a torrential downpour. Yet not a single explosion staggered the light. From the battlefield's edge, Esdeath watched Ethan's desperate onslaught with a slow, mocking smile. She shook her head as if pitying his naivete. Then her voice rang out across the clash of energies, brimming with arrogant contempt. "A mere grain of rice? Yet you dare to shine?" Her words were a blade to Ethan's heart, unleashing a fresh wave of pain. Rage flared at being so openly scorned, but deeper still was the humiliation of his failure to even faze her. At that instant, the jade embedded in his chest, once calm and silent, began to pound wildly, as if awakened by some hidden force. Bengyu throbbed violently, as though a wild heart had suddenly come to life. The gemstone embedded in Ethan's chest pulsed with the unmistakable echo of Esdeath's immense power, and it writhed beneath his skin like an untamed beast. Bengyu was more than just a source of strength or a trophy of Ethan's ambition. It held limitless power and boundless potential. Whenever he willed it, he could draw on energy far beyond any mortal limit. But now Bengyu was out of control. No longer the obedient instrument Ethan had mastered, it trembled with restlessness and longing. He recognized the cause at once. Esdeath's presence, the living embodiment of an all-seeing, all-powerful God-King, exuded an aura so overwhelming that even Bengyu, forged for limitless might, quailed before it. Worse still, the gem's unease had turned into something like betrayal. It seemed ready to cast Ethan aside and cling to Esdeath's power instead. "Bengyu," Ethan roared, every muscle tensing with anger and disbelief. He would not accept this treachery. Not from the very source of his strength. Ethan had always carried himself with unwavering arrogance and confidence, convinced he could bend every force in the world to his will, including the ancient power known as Bengyoku. But in this very moment, Bengyoku's pulse throbbed uncontrollably, as though it were desperate to burst free from Ethan's control. A cold knot of panic formed in his chest. If he didn't act now, he knew, Bengyoku would slip from his grasp and fall into Esdeath's clutches. Steeling himself, Ethan closed his eyes and drew in a slow, deliberate breath. He reached outward with his spirit, searching for the familiar ebb and flow of Bengyoku's energy and pressing his own will against its turmoil. "I refuse to let you go," he growled, his voice ricocheting across the deserted battlefield. He would not be the one to lose control, especially not to Esdeath, the so-called avatar of the God King's omnipotence. Nor would he admit defeat at the hands of Ichigo Kurosaki, who had only overcome him through underhanded trickery. As long as his resolve held firm, Ethan vowed, neither betrayal nor external power could shatter his rule. More than anything else, Ichigo Kurosaki's existence was Aizen Sosuke's own creation, and that realization eats away at him. After all the years he spent refining his experiments, this so-called test subject not only matched, but even surpassed his creator's own evolutionary breakthroughs. That blow to his pride shattered Aizen's faith in further Honyu-driven evolution. All the painstaking research, the Bengyu he had labored over for decades, what use was it if it couldn't outshine Ichigo? Now, however, the stakes are higher. Aizen must defeat Esdeath. If he cannot overcome her, how can he ever hope to challenge the God King? Drawing on every ounce of his indomitable will, he shatters the mental ceilings he once thought unbreakable. Power surges through him in a mad avalanche, as if reality itself has no choice but to yield. His flesh grows smoother, more vibrant, as though sheathed in an ethereal force. His eyes burn clearer and deeper, able to pierce through every illusion, every facade. At the brink of death, Aizen's desperate will to live stirs the collapsing jade within him. In that moment, he surrenders himself completely to its power, and rises, reborn in a form that knows no limits. Ethan's features shifted back to a human visage, but a network of violet veins now traced from the corners of his eyes, pulsing with each inhalation and exhalation. His eyes themselves had turned almost otherworldly, inky sclera framing stark white irises in sharp contrast. From his back unfurled 3 pairs of gossamer wings, each shimmering like a dragonfly's, and yet so potent they seemed built for unbridled flight. This new state felt more profoundly his own than any of the previous 5 transformations, truly the essence of self-power. No longer did he depend on outside forces or the collapsing jade's favor. Every ounce of strength and strategy came from within. Draped over his shoulders was a flowing white cape, and where a hollow once marred his chest now sat a deep purple crystal that exuded a subtle, hungry glow, as though it could consume all light and energy around it. Chapter 778, Perfect Fusion of Mirror Flower and Water Moon. Aizen Sosuke stood alone in the moonlit field, his figure radiating an almost palpable intensity. He flexed his limbs, feeling every sinew and every surge of spiritual energy distilled into a form both leaner and more potent than ever before. A confident smile curved his lips. He knew this new evolution wasn't flawless. He could already discern its weaknesses, yet his refusal to concede to Esdeath's overwhelming power had driven him to shatter his own limits, and the result was nothing short of miraculous. He didn't care whether some mysterious force had secretly aided this breakthrough. Ethan was not that force, nor could the inscrutable will of the Soul King, the supreme arbiter of life and death, be any easier to predict. In this moment, Aizen was no longer merely the death god who wielded his Zanpakuto to unleash the mirror flower, water moon technique. That power had now become an inseparable part of his very soul, woven into the core of his being. This fusion isn't a mere addition, it's a true leap in kind. Though his spiritual pressure no longer bursts forth with the same explosive ferocity, it's now steadier and purer. He has transcended his former self and ascended to an entirely new plane of power. "I understand," Aizen Sosuke whispered. "To surpass my past, to evolve without end, to embrace this new life until it reaches perfection. This is the purpose of existence, the higher calling I pursue." A firm light shone in his eyes, as if he'd already glimpsed his own future. Far off, Esdeath sensed the shift in Aizen's aura. Her brow drew tight, surprise flickering across her features. This altered Aizen Sosuke was stronger and more unsettling than any opponent she'd ever faced. His mirror flower, water moon technique had nearly overwhelmed her senses. Without her chi perception, she might already be blind. Putting her will into overdrive, Esdeath inhaled deeply and pushed her spiritual pressure to its absolute limit. In an instant, a brilliant star ignited in the sky alongside the moon, a tangible manifestation of her unleashed power. Esdeath's fist shot forward in the next instant, an immense surge of spiritual pressure coalescing around her arm. The impact detonated with an earth-shattering roar, unleashing a wave of energy that swept across the field like a tsunami, cracking the ground in its wake. At its epicenter, every spirit particle within miles was violently drawn inward, hollowing out a vast crater. The very air quivered, as if space itself were bending under the force. Then, reaching its limit, the pressure erupted. Towers of flame leapt skyward, and choking clouds of smoke and dust turned the heavens a bruised red. The surrounding space barrier shattered like glass, spraying its fragments in a glittering rain. The aftershock scoured everything in range, reducing the landscape to smoldering ruin. Yet at the heart of the devastation stood Aizen Sosuke, utterly unmarked. His calm silhouette rose from the wreckage, and his expression unreadable as he surveyed the ruin before him. Ethan had fully absorbed the power of Kagami Watermoon into every fiber of his being, and every pulse of his spiritual energy obeyed his command. With a subtle flick of his wrist, an unseen force swept away the swirling smoke and debris, laying bare the battlefield. "Can you still see me, Esdeath?" His voice carried across the now empty plain, laced with thinly veiled provocation. He stood cloaked in shadow, eyes glinting with calculated confidence. He knew Esdeath's perception of him was blurred, yet he also understood that the true battle was only beginning. A heavy silence settled, as though the wind itself dared not stir. "Are you speaking to me?" Esdeath's voice sliced through the stillness like a blade of ice. In the next heartbeat, Ethan realized her attack had been silent and swift. Her sword's edge was at his throat, so near he could feel its freezing intent. Ethan's pupils contracted in shock. Esdeath's blade hovered mere millimeters from his skin, radiating a merciless resolve that threatened to chill his very soul. Ethan barely registered surprise before reacting in an instant. He vanished in a flash and reappeared several meters from Esdeath. There was no trace of fear on his face, only a fierce, exhilarated light in his eyes. "So you really can still sense me," he murmured, voice low and challenging. Ethan's lips curved into a confident smile. Without warning, he blurred out again, and the moment he rematerialized, a crushing wave of spirit pressure exploded outward from his form, hurtling straight toward Esdeath. Boom! A blinding surge of violet collided with Esdeath's deep blue energy in midair, the impact roaring like thunder. Wherever those two forces met, reality itself trembled. Matter disintegrated at the point of contact, reduced to fine dust. The destructive aftershock came from the instantaneous clash of their densely packed spirit particles. Beneath them, the ground buckled and cracked under the assault, rupturing in a jagged web of fissures. From these splits gushed twin torrents of purple and azure light, rushing past one another like two raging rivers. Everything caught in their path, rock, earth, even the air, was unmade, swallowed by the white-hot void left in the wake of their collision. At the precise boundary where frigid darkness and manic light collided, two ruthless energies pressed against each other along a razor-straight divide. The inky blackness throbbed with wild, unhinged fervor, while the blinding radiance shimmered with an icy detachment. For a heartbeat, they hung in uneasy equilibrium, balanced yet trembling on the edge of rupture. Standing at that tense fulcrum, Ethan drew both forces into himself, channeling their power into a silver-white vortex that pulsed like a living thing. The swirling maelstrom sucked in every stray mote of energy until, at its roaring center, it crystallized into a single, transcendent blade. This sword was no mere metal. It was pure spiritual pressure, sharper than any forged steel and charged with a presence so potent it could sunder matter and soul alike. With a sudden flash of cold, argent light, the spirit blade tore through the surrounding void as if cleaving bamboo. Ethan's arm extended in a swift, decisive arc, sending the weapon hurtling toward Esdeath. In that instant, the air itself seemed to shiver, and the sword's malevolent gleam promised one thing above all: absolute destruction. An uncanny spiritual pressure washed over the area. Esdeath sensed that Aizen Sosuke's Ryatsu had undergone a fundamental transformation. Chapter 779. Aizen. Tired. Ethan stepped onto the battlefield, his senses screaming that something was horribly wrong. The stillness that had fallen over the war zone didn't bring relief. It shattered like glass, torn apart by an unseen force that made the very air shudder. He recognized the source in an instant, the spiritual pressures of countless fallen and fighting warriors, energies that had once fueled them in combat. But these souls were no longer free. From the center of this rippling haze, he felt a single, unmistakable will, the mind of Sosuke Aizen. In a breathtaking act of mastery, Aizen had recoded those scattered spiritual pressures, folding them into his own strength. What remained were no longer mere echoes of Soldier's resolve, but living, self-aware extensions of Aizen's intent, an invisible legion obeying his every thought. Ethan shivered as he realized this was something neither the raw might of the Quincy nor the destructive fury of a god of destruction could rival. Aizen had given this new force a name: Mirrors and Moonlight. Beautiful, with a hidden bite. Like a flawless mirror, it could reflect the darkest fears and unspoken desires lodged in every soul. Like the moon's pale glow, it exposed every shadowed corner of reality. Now that power swirled all around Ethan, ready to turn his deepest doubts into lethal illusions, and to do so at the command of the man standing at its heart. Underneath that breathtaking, ethereal beauty lurked a deadly threat. The moment this power unfurled, its sword-light flashing, its oppressive force sweeping through the air, it felt as if the world itself had shifted. A profound vastness pressed against Esdith's soul, irresistible in its pull. She was the first to bear its full weight. Before her eyes, the battlefield dissolved into an endless void, as though the entire universe lay spread out in the night sky. Stars shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and an immense, boundless moon hovered at the horizon, bathing everything in its soft, enchanting light. The scene was so vivid she almost forgot she was on a war-torn field. But Esdith knew better. This was Aizen Sosuke's mirror flower, water moon, an illusion so potent it seized her senses and wove a tapestry of fantasy around her mind. She struggled to discern illusion from reality, but the technique clamped around her consciousness like an invisible hand. Despite her own formidable power, far surpassing Aizen's in many respects, she could not deny that this ability was both terrifying and sublime. Ethan had faced countless powerful enemies and seen a dizzying array of skills, but he had never felt anything so raw, so overwhelming. Esdith's power cut straight to his core, leaving him utterly defenseless. Even Aizen Sosuke's fearsome abilities now seemed pale in comparison. In the pale glow of the moon, Esdith's soul blade gleamed with a frigid light. She brought the knife to a horizontal position before her, then let her palm drift slowly across the blade's edge. Its icy hardness was strangely comforting to her. She inhaled deeply, gathering every ounce of her will into that single weapon. There was no earth-shattering shockwave, no mountains crumbling or skies splitting. There was only her, calm, composed, swinging the blade as if performing a ritual. Time itself seemed to still. The sword's flash was unremarkable, its presence undramatic, and yet it held boundless power. When its silvery arc and the crushing force behind it merged, the very fabric of the battlefield tore asunder. The moment Esdith's blade of light struck the barrier, the once perfect moon split open, a jagged crack running through its surface. In that instant, the merged power of the mirror flower and the moon, an artifice that wove together truth and illusion, shattered from within. The entire projection trembled and then dissolved, scattering like mist before dawn. Standing amid the ruins of his technique, Aizen Sosuke stared at Esdith with disbelief etched on his face. He had prided himself on this evolved form of the mirror flower and the mu, infused with the very essence of his soul and refined beyond the reach of any ordinary soul reaper. In his mind, only Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni's legendary Ryujin Jaka could ever match such power. And yet here it lay broken, felled by Esdith's single unerring stroke. God of destruction, is it really that powerful? Ethan steadied himself as Esdith's grin widened. He could feel her destructive aura, relentless, untamed, almost mindless, and yet she had just outmatched him. In that instant, he knew the truth. She wasn't a master tactician, but a living force of raw numbers, an overwhelming juggernaut far beyond his reach. Otherwise, she never could have shattered his mirror flower water moon technique with a single effortless stroke. Even its evolved form, designed purely for brute output, proved no match for her blade. "Can it grow any stronger?" Esdith asked, tilting the tip of her sword toward him. Ethan gave no answer. Without hesitation, she swept the blade in a clean arc. His torso split in two. The Hogyoku within him cracked and exploded, scattering sparks of power that winked out in midair. Yet even as his upper half slumped toward the ground, Ethan's essence, now transcendent beyond mere Shinigami or hollow, refused to yield. He clutched the scorched earth, crimson staining his fingers, and pushed himself upright. Blood oozed from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "What are you planning to do with me now?" he rasped, voice echoing across the silent battlefield. Esdeath paused, her chilling smile unwavering. The wind stilled. Even in pieces, Ethan stood ready for whatever came next. Esdeath deactivated her soul blade and studied Aizen calmly. "Why should I bother with you?" she asked, her voice icy. Aizen Sosuke lay on the ground, silent. He understood perfectly well. The only reason Esdeath's forces had pursued him was his assault on the Soul Society. He felt no remorse for that attack. When the situation is unclear, gathering intelligence takes priority. Nor did he regret what had come afterward. "Esdeath!" came Bylergan's shout as he and several others rushed into the clearing. They found Aizen crumpled on one knee. Black Hollow's maw worked eagerly, dribbling. It sensed a staggering, unique spiritual pressure in Aizen, and even though that pressure was now hidden, devouring him promised unimaginable power. Bylergan's face twisted with pure hatred. Nearby, bloody footprints marked the approach of Zaraki Kenpachi, limping heavily but unbowed. Kenpachi stopped a few paces away and called out, "Are we taking him back with us?" The others exchanged confused looks. Kenpachi's eyes gleamed as he explained, "He's incredibly strong. If he ever becomes a god of destruction, he'll be unstoppable." Esdeath shrugged. "Do as you wish." She gave no thought to whether Aizen might betray her after attaining such power. His potential was all that mattered. "Could you please provide the full chapter text that you'd like me to rewrite? Once I have the complete passage, I'll transform it into coherent, idiomatic English, renaming the protagonist to Ethan and ensuring he's clearly male while preserving all plot points and details." Chapter 780, A New Challenge, Aizen's Ambition. "You can't bring Aizen back." Bylergan's warning rang through the void, heavy with urgency. He betrayed the gods of death and the hollows. His only loyalty is to power. Even if he ascends as god of destruction, mark my words, he'll turn on us too. Zaraki Kenpachi didn't even flinch. Fighting was his lifeblood, and his hunger for strength bordered on obsession. To him, Aizen's past betrayals were irrelevant beside the raw might he now commanded. "Who cares?" Kenpachi replied with chilling calm. "I believe in power alone. Aizen's strength surpasses that of any Shinigami or hollow, and that's exactly why I want him." Aizen arched an eyebrow at the offer, amusement dancing in his eyes. He had never imagined Kenpachi would intend to elevate him to God of Destruction. "God of Destruction, you say?" Aizen murmured, a playful smile curving his lips. "Not a bad title." He paused, his gaze drifting as if recalling a distant memory. "It took centuries to reach the summit of the death gods," he continued softly. "I pushed past every limit, but perhaps it's time for a new peak. Although I've already outstripped the god of death and even the hollow, I'm still completely helpless against Esdeath, the god of destruction." Aizen's chest rose and fell as the truth struck him like a thunderbolt. The god of destruction existed on a plane far beyond anything he'd yet encountered. If such power could be attained, might it be pushed even further still? A strange, bitter laugh escaped his lips. Once upon a time, his greatest wish had been almost ordinary, to live as a simple man, to taste friendship, love, and the thrill of battle. But the moment he learned the true nature of the Soul King, every modest desire vanished. He resolved, instead, to claim godhood for himself. Now, bruised and teetering on the brink of unconsciousness, a fierce light still burned in his eyes. A new horizon spread out before his mind, calling to him. He ached for power, for limitless transcendence, to stand unchallenged at the pinnacle of existence. Kenpachi Zaraki had just offered him a path, the chance to become a god of destruction in his own right. "I will become the god of destruction," Aizen vowed inwardly, every fiber of his being ignited by that single, relentless ambition. "Then I'll test my limits and see if I have what it takes to surpass Esdeath, the mightiest god of destruction. And one day, I'll become something even greater." With those words, Ethan was born into the divine realm. It was his first time here, and the difference was breathtaking. The air itself thrummed with spiritual energy so dense it felt almost solid, and Ethan welcomed it. He understood why. The shattered remnants of Bengu, cleaved apart by Esdeath, had fused entirely with him. What remained of Bengu was a hollow shell. Its true power now coursed through Ethan. He carried the essence of the Soul King, his body reshaped by that divine force. In strength and form, he was on par with the legendary warriors of the Zero Division, perhaps even beyond them. Ethan took a steady breath and surveyed the heavens before him. So this is the world of the gods. Dominating his view was the God King's palace, a vast hall suspended high above clouds whose depth seemed endless. There lies the God King's throne room, he murmured. Yet despite its splendor, no oppressive aura pressed in upon him. The hall sat in serene quiet, as if awaiting his arrival rather than challenging his might. Ethan stepped through the divine gate, and immediately Esdeath's familiar spiritual pressure washed over him, yet the great oppressive aura of the divine king remained curiously absent. Before he could dwell on that unsettling gap, Esdeath reappeared, and without a word, turned on her heel and strode away. Ethan watched her go, then followed at a distance, silent and alert. Not far off, Zaraki Kenpachi seized Aizen by the robes and marched him over to Unohana Retsu. "Captain Unohana," Kenpachi rumbled, "I didn't expect to find you here." Unohana's expression was as inscrutable as ever. She tilted her head, studying Aizen. "Aizen," she said softly, "it seems you lost this round." From the shadows, Mao Jihuali observed the exchange with perfect stillness. Aizen's eyes flicked to her, noting the lack of agitation in her gaze. He understood quickly. She too had betrayed the Seirete. Neither bore more grievance against the other. Unohana shifted her focus back to the prisoner. "If you've come all this way," she continued, her voice calm but unyielding, "it can only be for one reason. You seek the power of the god of destruction." Maujiwali stepped forward. Her eyes were cool, her tone steady. The fierce fighting spirit and murderous intent that had once driven her were gone, spent in her earlier battles. "Yes," she admitted, "I want that power." Aizen, bound yet unbowed, lifted his chin. There was no trace of a broken spirit in his face, only resolve. "I make no mistake about my situation," he said quietly, "but I will not remain a mere captive. I will be the one to seize that power, and I will not fail." Unohana Retsu gave a small nod and extended her hand, presenting Aizen with a new blade. "This is the Soul Blade," she said. Aizen took the weapon. It felt nothing like the asau he'd wielded before, yet the instant he grasped its hilt, he recognized his Zanpakuto's true name. The blade itself remained silent, no blossoming aura, no whisper of power. Aizen's eyes gleamed with challenge. "The release of a soul blade follows the same principle as your Zanpakuto," Unohana continued. "We call it drawing your sword. The moment you draw this blade, you channel your spirit's essence. Part of your own power flows into it, and time itself becomes a force of destruction." She spoke plainly, revealing every secret without hesitation. Aizen stood perfectly still, drinking in each word. In raw might he may have surpassed both Unohana Retsu and Zaraki Kenpachi, but here, in the realm of soul-forged weaponry, he was still merely a student. Kenpachi Zaraki and Retsu Unohana, he thought, they have already attained the status of gods of destruction. Aizen understood the title well. Only those who truly embody annihilation merit the name. Esdeath was one such deity. How long she had borne that dreadful mantle remained a mystery. Preliminary analysis suggests that her entire spiritual pressure has been transformed into pure destructive power, which explains the terrifying might she now wields. Even Unohana Retsu and Zaraki Kenpachi, who have only recently ascended to the rank of gods of destruction and thus possess only modest reserves of destructive energy, far surpass any captain-level Shinigami or Vastold-class Hollow. Their destructive power is simply on a different order of quality. Aizen, for his part, has set his sights on a new goal, to become a god of destruction himself as quickly as possible. His return has left both the Shinigami and the Arankar seething. After all, Ulquiorra and the massive Yami have fallen, and Ichimaru Gin and Tosen remain missing, presumed dead in the aftermath of the last great battle. Yet complaining won't turn the tide. Aizen's strength has grown so colossal that no one can even sense his spiritual pressure anymore. It exists on a dimension entirely beyond theirs. All they can do now is follow the same path, claim the mantle of God of Destruction first, then stand a chance of challenging Aizen. Ethan stood with the Soul Society emissaries as they emerged into the living world. All along, the Technology Development Bureau had faithfully reported every tremor of the Great War below, but the Soul Society's leaders had chosen to hold back, waiting for the dust to settle and a clear victor to emerge. Only once the final clash had ended did they authorize a full deployment. Even the elite Zero Division was dispatched to survey the aftermath firsthand. When their group finally appeared amidst the ruined skyline, a hush fell over them. Charred craters pockmarked the earth, shattered buildings lay in splinters, and the acrid tang of smoke hung heavy in the air. Ethan inhaled sharply. Beside him, Esdith's pale eyes swept over the devastation with unmistakable disapproval. Neither she nor any of the others would have agreed to make this blasted plain the stage for a showdown with Eisen. The scene before them was proof enough that, when titans clash, the world itself pays a terrible price. Chapter 781. The Empire in the Shadows. Fortunately, Eisen hadn't established his research base in Karakura Town. If he had, Ichigo Kurosaki and his allies would almost certainly have been wiped out. In fact, on the brink of death, Ichigo might well have carved Eisen to pieces with his own Zenpakuto. What happened? One of the Shinigami asked, eyes wide with shock. An entire city had been obliterated. Countless souls must have perished. It was a clash between the god of destruction and Eisen, another voice answered grimly. The Zero Division had recently deployed a new device, designed by Ichibei Hyoshibu, to detect residual energies of pure annihilation. Their sensors were still picking up terrifying tremors of destructive power lingering in the ruins. If those remains weren't swiftly cleansed, any soul, or even Shinigami, entering the area would face instant obliteration. Eisen? I thought he was sealed away in Hueco Mundo, one officer protested. He was driven there by the god of destruction, the report continued, but ultimately defeated and forced back into the real world. The Zero Division tracked him here, then linked up with Kisuke Urahara and the Masked Corps. That's when all hell broke loose. Silence fell over the gathered Shinigami. Two of the most fearsome beings they'd ever known had clashed, and a city had been the battlefield. Now the cleanup would fall to them. And somewhere in the shadows, Eisen was still at large. They had witnessed the entire battle. Now Urahara Kisuke and the Masked Corps found themselves in a tangle of emotions. For years they'd lived in the human world, hunted by Eisen, forced to hide their true identities and labeled fugitives by the Soul Society. They'd endured without striking back, until now. Eisen, the very embodiment of overwhelming power, so potent that his mere spiritual pressure threatened to shatter their souls, had finally fallen. He'd been defeated by the god of destruction, and then carried away. News of this astounding victory reached the Soul Reapers of the Zero Division and the Shinigami Command without delay. They hurried back to the Soul Society, reported everything, and immediately dispatched a team from the Technology Development Bureau to the human realm. Their mission: assess whether the god of destruction's power could be contained or even neutralized. No one underestimated the importance of this moment. It was a rare chance to study and ultimately prepare to confront the power that had bested Eisen himself. Ethan stood just beyond the clearing's edge, his gaze fixed on the afterglow of the clash. If Mayuri Kurotsuchi and Kisuke Urahara could dissect and neutralize this power of destruction, they'd finally have a fighting chance against the god of destruction. If not, well, they'd be utterly powerless. He couldn't help but wish Mayuri and Urahara would work their analytical magic, and yet, deep down, he sensed those fears were unfounded. Across the field, Esdeath alone had the capacity to unleash or dissipate true destructive energy. Kenpachi Zaraki and Eisen had poured everything into their duel, but what remained of their destructive aura was now so faint it would vanish in a handful of heartbeats. Even Esdeath's formidable reserves would dwindle in a matter of days at most. Unless she deliberately channeled that force, it would never coalesce into a radiation-like wasteland. Still, there was one question that haunted them. Why had the god of destruction seized Eisen? Were his intentions to drag Eisen back for execution? If so, might that shatter the seal over hell itself? Eisen's raw power had always been the linchpin holding the infernal gates closed. Perhaps that was why, in the original timeline, no one had dared to kill him outright. Ethan's heart pounded at the thought. Whatever was coming next, they could only prepare. and hope their tenuous defenses would hold. Everyone knew Aizen couldn't be killed, not simply because of his prodigious power, but because only he could keep the rift of hell sealed. When Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni fell in battle, and Unohana Retsu likewise gave her life, the seal weakened. The lid over that bottomless abyss threatened to burst open. Some whispered that Aizen's ultimate goal was to ascend as a god of destruction. Others argued he was driven by an even greater ambition to shatter the balance of the three realms entirely. Either way, his schemes were an intolerable wild card for the Zero Squad. Despite their combined might, they had no means to stop him. Even approaching the ruler of the spirit world was hopeless. His Majesty the God King brooked no petitions. Only the Soul King himself had any hope of an audience. Hyosubu Ichibei had ventured before, barely survived the encounter, and returned a husk of his former strength. The turmoil in the Soul Society and the Zero Squad's desperation were matched by a far darker dread. Deep beneath the Soul Palace, concealed in shadow, lay the Invisible Empire, an organization so secret it was whispered about only in nightmares. Their resources rivaled those of the gods of death themselves. The very foundations of the spirit world trembled at their name. And at the center of that hidden dominion marched the Quincy, a people once all but forgotten. Now they rose as the final adversary looming over the Soul Society, a threat whose power could unmake the world of the dead and reshape reality itself. The Quincy are such formidable warriors that even the combined forces of the Soul Society and Hueco Mundo struggle to match them. Their power springs from a unique physiology. They draw in and manipulate reishi, spirit particles, directly from the world around them. In the realm of the dead, these particles form the very foundation of life and matter. Once a Quincy refines this gift, they can decompose and absorb any reishi-based substance, commanding spirit particles as though they were extensions of their own will. On the battlefield, this talent is devastating. A seasoned Quincy can siphon away the reishi that sustains a Shinigami's body, using it to bolster his own strength. It's this ability that has earned them the title of arch-nemesis of the death gods, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the Soul Society. At the pinnacle of Quincy power stands their ancestor, Yuwatch. Thousands of years ago, he marshaled his people in a titanic showdown against the 13 court guard squads led by the captain commander of the Soul Society. Both sides suffered grievous losses, but ultimately it was Yuwatch who fell, temporarily halting the Quincy threat, though their legacy would not soon be forgotten. He had lost his heartbeat, his consciousness, and all his strength, as if he'd teetered on the very edge of death. Yet Yuwatch did not perish. Instead, amid that interminable darkness, he seized the chance to be reborn. Much like the God of the Bible, he lay dormant in the void. 900 years to rekindle his heartbeat, 90 more to reclaim his mind, and another 9 to restore his power. The journey was grueling, but through iron will and unshakable faith, Yuwatch endured. When he finally awakened, he was no longer the defeated soul of old, but the undisputed progenitor of the Quincy, an entity of omniscience and omnipotence. Though he would require time to heal fully, a new and undeniable threat had already made itself known to the Invisible Empire, the God King. Rival to the Soul King himself, this being had forged the divine realm and the Soul Palace with a single gesture, shattering any illusion of invincibility the Empire once cherished. Although the Quincy scouts returned with reports, none were as detailed as what they'd overheard in the Soul Palace. At the heart of the Invisible Empire lies the King's Palace, known to all as the Ice Palace, a realm of frozen grandeur. The moment you step inside, you're greeted by a boundless swath of white, like a tundra trapped in midwinter, its stillness heavy with solemnity. Beneath your feet, the polished floor gleams like a mirror, its faint glow hinting that it could betray even the most hidden thoughts. All around, walls of flawless, crystal-clear ice rise up, their razor-sharp edges radiating a majestic, untouchable chill.